error messages are the user interface of your entire programming language. They're like, oh, won't it be cool if you could do like an if statement like this? And it's like, yeah, but that doesn't solve the big engineering problems. That just feels cool when you're first learning the language, right? I will say it is not a self-deprecating acronym. Like, just an idea is such a dumb thing to name your language because you're like saying, oh, my thing, I'm not really trying to do anything useful or important. I just had an idea one day, man. No, that's not. I will unequivocally state that that is not what it is.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Game Engineering Podcast. Today I am joined by Jonathan Blow, a game designer and programmer who made Braid and The Witness and is now working on a new programming language as well as 2 new games. I am truly honored to have had this conversation. Jonathan had huge influence on me, both regarding the passion for video games, but also the attitude to pursue excellence and become better at my craft every day. The conversation starts very technically. Jonathan dives deep into the design of a macro system in his new programming language called Jai. After discussing the language, he showcases the upcoming unnamed Sokoban game. We then move towards more general questions about the role of a game designer, how his company Thekla operates, and the state of game development in 2025. And without further ado, let's meet Jonathan Blow. Regarding the status update of Jai,
Yeah.
last time, I think the last status update from compiler beta, it was in September, and you said that there are 3 things on the roadmap. Strongly
Yes.
typed macro system, cross-compiling support, and DLLs compiled at a different point in time. There's this problem with like runtime context and how to
Yeah.
coordinate, synchronize that. And you outlined these like 3 things. And then you said that maybe after tackling those 3, Jai will be out for public access.
Yes.
How does that look like now?
Well, what I've been doing since then is I've been trying to approach the macro system problem directly, and it's an interesting thing. Okay, let me go back and I'll talk about the macro system a little bit and what the idea was and how it works now and all this stuff, right? So the idea was similar to many ideas in this programming language. Okay, let's even one more step back. Okay, so you have a language like C that was made in 1970 and was very effective, right? And it was very effective because it was simple, it was low level, um, it could target a lot of different computers at the time, um, and that just meant to do all those things at once meant certain classes of decisions had to be made. And so there are all sorts of problems in C that if C were designed today would not be problems. So for example, back in 1970, you had all these machines with different byte sizes, right? You had computers with 6-bit bytes, and you had 8-bit bytes, and you had 12-bit bytes, I think. And just extrapolate that to everything, right? So there was this extreme degree of unknownness, right? And so you couldn't, that's why integer types on C are just sort of unknown size officially, even though you kind of know that they're 4 bytes or 8 bytes, depending on what you're doing, and all these things, right? So here's the thing is that now, literally 50 years after C was successful, right, we're in a very different computing environment. And if you want to make a language that's able to target low-level programs like that, you don't have to deal with the same degree of unknownness everywhere and all of this. And secondly, like back when C was made, it was like this sort of like, hey, let's just hack together a programming language and like play with it. It's kind of like how JavaScript started, actually, right? It was just like, look, we're just putting this thing in the web browser to do some if statements and whatever. It's not a real programming language, right? And that's fine to get started, but sometimes you end up paying a lot more for that than you wish you did. And in the last 30 years or something, we've kept paying for some of these early decisions in C. And so part of the goal is to go back and look at the other major language paradigm, like the functional programming languages, and say, what did they do well? What did they get right? You know, and I am not a functional programming language. I'm not one of these people who like thinks they're uh, the answer to everything. And there's all these like religious zealot people on the internet. But I mean, look, I do think they got some things correct. For example, if you're building a C program or a C++ program, or even like a Rust program or whatever now, right? The build process inherently involves the operating system in a very specific way, right? So like a C program is a bunch of C.C files, or a C++ program is a bunch of .cpp files. Actually, they kept changing the extension for a long time, right? It was like .c++, and then it was .cxx in case plus was hard to type, and it was .c sometimes, and the compiler was supposed to figure, or it was .C also, and then that didn't work on Windows because of case insensitivity. Like, just the file extension has gone through so much history in C++. Um, but the point is, it's just a bunch of these files, right? And they just live on the disk. And then what defines what your program is? Well, it's some program in another language, like a makefile or something. And actually now, so if you're a modern Linux person, it's not just, there's like a CMake file or like a Ninja config file or whatever that is that generates all these other
Yes.
things, right?
Yes.
And so you need like 4 other programming languages just to decide what your program means. That just seems really bad and wrong. And as soon as you start trying to target a lot of platforms like we do in the games industry, it's very obvious how that's wrong, because you just have your like, I did all this work to specify a program is the act of being very specific about what the computer should do from moment to moment. And then you bring this all over to another operating system and you still can't run it without like doing all that. Like, oh, now I'm in Visual Studio, so like I have to import all these things into this weird IDE, or I have to learn this MS build syntax and make the equivalent of a make file over there, but it's not a make file, it's a different thing, right? Oh, now I'm going to Mac, right? And all this stuff. And or I'm going to some, sometimes, so for example, when I was working on it was actually before PlayStation 3 came out. Um, I was working with some people on a project for like a bring up board for the cell processor when the cell processor barely existed or something. Like, sometimes you go into these really weird environments, right? And it's like, okay, what do we have to work with here? And even if you have something like make, I mean, a lot of operating systems are like Unix offshoots or something. It often will have incompatibilities, or some of the things the make file is trying to run to do the things to run your program are don't work exactly the same over here, or what. You just run into all these endless problems just to compile your thing. And it's like, okay, that is a mistake, because your program is, like I said, it's one way to look at it. There's the operational way of looking at it, which is it is an extremely specific set of instructions about what to do. So why can't you just do it? Why can't my computer just do it? Why do I have to do all this stuff? And then the functional programmer way of looking at it is like, look, my program is a mathematical object. The output of this thing is well defined. Why should a mathematical object change meaning or be hard to interpret as you move it around, right? And so that was one of the lessons that I took early on in defining this programming language, is like, look, it's not going to require any kind of external build apparatus at all. And I realize I'm getting kind of off topic, but I'm gonna kind of bring it back on
Okay.
topic. But so the reason this happened is incidental, right? If you look at the early functional languages like Lisp, the way they worked was it was an interpreter. So you had to kind of load all the files to do anything, because otherwise at any moment you could call a function that is in a file you didn't load. So the interpreters just load all the files and then run them. And it's like, okay, why did we get away from that? Well, C probably had to run on computers with very small amounts of resources, right? And so maybe so it made sense to compile things into a bunch of small .o files and then link them, right? But the problem, of course, is just you're externalizing some of your semantics. Okay, so that long explanation was just a simple example of one of the inspirations that's not even about being a functional programming language, but it's something the functional programming language community got right, like by accident. So any of these languages, like standard ML of New Jersey was the same way. It would like load all the files, and I think it compiled them. I don't remember. It was like 30 years ago that I used this, but like it had this same aesthetic that like your program is well defined. It doesn't need the operating system to give it meaning. It's well defined on its own, right? So that's one thing they got right. Now, one of the things that Lisp is famous for, or infamous for, is its macro system, right? So now we're getting back on topic, where you could take code that looked kind of like Lisp code, but really, as long as you have a lot of parentheses, like anything looks like Lisp code, because that's all it is. And you could run it through a macro that could like rewrite and exchange things around and do all these things. And it was a very powerful mechanism, right? And so I was looking at that, and because I wanted some kind of a macro system, because in C, macros are very useful. Even in C++, they're very useful, but also people kind of hate them, right? Like if you're going to port some code or try to understand it, and you see a file full of like all these big macros, you're just like, oh my God, right? Because for those not familiar with C, which is, I don't know, what percentage of your audience is fluent in C?
I
Low?
wouldn't assume that there's a high percentage, but
Oh,
yeah,
high. Okay,
I
great.
wouldn't assume that.
Oh, you wouldn't assume high. Okay.
Right.
The point being, okay, so the C macro system is actually very powerful for how it works, which is just it does a textual rewrite on your source file before you compile it, right? And so it's essentially a string replace. Um, it's not a super powerful string replace. It doesn't have like regex or anything, but it has, you can do something where it looks like calling a function, and instead of that function call, you're sort of giving it a replacement string. And the reason that's very powerful is because you can completely violate normal syntactical rules and all this stuff in terms of like, you can insert things that are only half of an expression or half of an identifier and concatenate that to something else, right? It's not related to the parse tree or even the token stream. It comes before the token stream. That's very powerful. But this is also what makes it completely undebuggable, right? Because the rest of the programming language doesn't understand the macros at all. Okay, so when I went into this language, I was like, okay, I want to do macros, but I want them to be more understandable and more debuggable, and then also hygienic, right? Which non-functional programmers don't necessarily know what that means. Um, or I guess some other imperative languages have hygienic macros now. But so in C, again, because a macro is a string replacement, then that string replacement changes meaning depending on where in your program you use it, because any variable that it tries to use could get shadowed. Like if your function,
Yes.
like if it's trying to read a global and then your function defines that name and you use the macro inside the function, now the macro won't work correctly, but it'll be very hard to understand why it's broken, because it's just a mess. And so that's why when people write these macros, if they're intended to be used over a wide area, you start naming the variable names with like some really long prefix and a lot of underscores and a lot of capital letters and whatever. And that's not actually a guarantee that you'll never have this problem, but it makes it extremely unlikely that anyone else is ever going to use that same name and break your macro, right? Um, at the same time, though, um, it's also kind of powerful in this very sloppy way, because you could design a macro where you say, I'm going to use this in a function, and that function should have a global variable named X. It's not even going to be a parameter to the macro. We're just going to use that. And again, if somebody forgets to define X, that could be a confusing error message, but you at least have that expressive power and you can design your macro that way, right? So in contrast, we're being like functional languages, and we have hygienic macros, which is that they have their own namespace. They're like a function. If they declare variables or whatever, it doesn't pollute the calling site, right? But then we have some mechanisms by which you can read the local variables of the calling site and all this. And sometimes these are a little bit more annoying to use, like in the case of multiply nested macros and stuff. We're still working out those details of how to make it nice. Um, but so far, oh, and the other thing about our macros is they're actually exactly like functions in every other way. So they have type checking like functions, unlike C macros, right? And they actually could be overloaded with functions. And when you do function call resolution, it could be either a macro or a function. It's like extremely clean and uniform in that way. And
Can I ask?
then one of the things,
Can I?
one of the things you
Yeah,
can do
yeah, yeah.
internal to a macro, instead of the macro being a string rewrite, um, it can change the code around, but it does it by reinserting new code, which it can generate. And that could either be in the form of a string. So you could create a new string and put it at the old site of the macro. But unlike C, and this is an advantage and a disadvantage, that has to be a syntactical unit because it gets parsed separately, right? So you can't do some of these weird tricks. Well, you would do them in a different way. Like in C, if you want to create a new identifier that's like partly what someone passed in and then partly a tag, you could create that identifier, but it's not like they would pass that in explicitly as a parameter, probably. Um, as a um, we're getting off. There's a way that you can mark it where you say like, I don't mean this to be an identifier yet, and then it can get passed in. So you can do it. It just requires slightly more syntax. But then the other way, so to try to bring this whole discussion, this 20-minute long answer to an end, the other way you can insert code inside the macro is as a syntax tree. And there's a way to get the syntax tree of the arguments that were passed in, and you can inspect it, and you can move the nodes around if you want, or you could generate new ones and attach them to the old ones. And the thing is, so this is the equivalent of like what Lisp used to do, but it's, this is a static programming language that's imperative. And so it has a lot more type checking at compile time than something like Lisp. And so what that means is you have the equivalent of a tagged union of all the node types, right? And nodes point at other nodes, and those pointers could have subtypes, right? So like a declaration has a slot of the name, and that has to be an identifier. It's not like a general node and whatever, right? So there's type checking on all these things. And so that just means when you're trying to do these rewrites, it's not as simple as it was in Lisp, right? Because in Lisp, you just say, oh, take slot 3 and put it over here and whatever. And now it's like you're assigning specific pointers with specific names to all these nodes. And I knew that going in, and I wanted to do the experiment of like, what does this look like? Because I'd never seen anyone do it. And it works, but it's like, it's a little tedious. And so there's some combination that we want to do of user level functions just to make this easier, but then also further compiler support. We had a new idea come in a couple of weeks ago from one of our beta users that sounds pretty good to me, about just a way to compose code from pieces in syntax without going all the way to the node representation and editing those data structures and coming back, which you can still do, and you may want to do in specific cases, but the question is like, can we make it more facile? And so that's part of the picture. Like, I just wanted to give you a real answer about all this.
Okay.
And why, like the explanation of why it would take a long time to figure out. The reason it takes a long time to figure out is because we're trying to do the best thing. And I don't exactly know what the best thing is for any of these. Like, if I knew what the best thing is, I could sit down and program it, and it doesn't honestly take that long usually, right? But it's these last few issues are the issues where, like, I kind of don't know, and some exploration is required.
Okay. On that note, in Jai you have compile time execution. So
Yeah.
isn't this sort of adjacent or like an alternative way of doing the same thing with macros?
Yes. So there is a question. This is a constant question of like, when you start implementing some functionality, is this really the best way to do it? should you be doing it a different way, right? And there's sort of two in the abstract, there's two extremes that you could land on. And the extreme is never the right answer, right? But one extreme, which is what you will learn if you go to a pretty good computer school and they teach you about programming languages, right? That extreme is the actual base implementation of the language should be the minimal thing that achieves the functionality that you want. And then just higher level features should be buildable at user level by composing these language kernel features, you would say, right, together to build things. And the problem with that is that could be very slow and very hard to understand if you go to debug it. And like ergonomics matter, right? You know, if you're going to sit down and program something, when I'm first learning a language, it might feel awesome and fun and cool that it's like very minimal and provides all these weird ways for me to combine the minimal axes of functionality to generate what I want. But on day 1000 in a row that I've been programming in this language, I'm not going to enjoy that anymore if what I really want is to get the job done and not have to do a bunch of stupid things, right? So that's one reason why that extreme is not good. Like ergonomics matter, and it really matters that what you want to do frequently is easy and fun and readable and understandable by other people who are not you, or understandable by you 3 months later when you go away and you haven't looked at the code and you come back, right? The other extreme, which happens with, like, a lot of the time when people enthusiastically design programming languages and like don't have an education in this stuff, or haven't, I mean, not to, like, I don't respect computer science education that much. I mean, it was good that I went back then, but now it's, you know, it's literally 30 years later than I was in college, and like all this information is on the internet and you can get it on your own if you're diligent. You have to be good about really wanting the high quality information, because there's also a lot of trash out there. But the other extreme is to be some language like Perl or whatever, where you take that ergonomic to the limit and you're just like, look, anytime I think of a cool syntax that lets me say something in 2 characters less than I would have been able to say it otherwise, I'm just going to put that in the language, right? And the problem then is your language becomes incredibly complicated and full of all these constructs that everybody has to learn. And you know, if you have language tools, they all have to implement and understand all these things. And like your syntax errors get way worse and less understandable, which is very important. I'll get back to that in a second, right? But like the more syntactical constructs you have, then anytime you make a minor 1 character mistake, the more likely the compiler is to be wrong about what it thought you were saying. And so it could give you a different error message for a different situation. And you're like, wait, this is confused. What's it talking about? And it takes you longer to debug, right? So the thing to understand is that error messages are the user interface of your entire programming language. They're the main interface that programmers deal with. And so if they're not good, like, the amount of work that everybody has to do goes up by a large factor. It's very expensive for your error messages to be bad. And that's why you shouldn't use these compiler generation tools that they teach you to use in computer school, because they lead to worse error messages, among other outcomes. But okay, wait, what was the original question?
The question was what weren't macros are does macro
Oh yeah, the
system work the
redundancy
same way?
between,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, so here's the thing. When we come to this topic, there's a little bit of redundancy between several things. So we have regular functions, right? So I just said macros look like functions, right? We have regular functions. We have inline functions, which are mandatory inline. And that would actually be classically in C one reason that you would use macros, because you didn't, like, function calls in the old days were pretty expensive, and sometimes you wanted to make sure you avoided them. And so you would just use a C macro to make sure that you didn't have a function call there. And that's still, I would say, the use of of that is much reduced in the modern day, but it's still a thing. Like sometimes you really just want to make sure. So we have inline functions for that, but you also could use macros for that. So that's some overlap and redundancy. And then there's compile time execution, and the answer is yes, there is redundancy there. However, I think it falls into the case where the ergonomics matter enough to maintain the redundancy. And I'll try to explain why, right? One thing that I got correct early on. Okay, so a lot of things in the design of this language reflect frustrations that I had trying to learn all these things, use all these systems as a programmer for a long time. And one of the frustrations that I had is when you start trying to use a programming language and it's too soft. So like Tickle or Perl were like this, or PHP, or JavaScript without type checking, like TypeScript or something on top. They're too soft, and it leads to like all these, like I typed an undeclared identifier and it took me a half an hour to figure that out because I tried to use it and it was the empty string. And like now I have to have a debugging session to figure out what was going on. Whereas in a statically typed language, it takes a tenth of a second to know that that identifier is undeclared, right? And this is a very, very valuable thing, right? So softness versus hardness is important. And so one of the things that I felt when I was doing this compile time execution, the initial implementation, is I had all this experience with these interpreted systems. The first computer class at Berkeley where I went to school was using Scheme, and Scheme was not compile time statically typed. And it had all these other problems. Like it didn't have very many actual data structures and whatever. So you would do everything as lists, and then you would have these debugging sessions where you pass a list to your function and the function expects it to be a certain shape and it's not. And you're like, what's going on? And it's a tremendous waste because it, like all these students who come to the school and they're like, I'm going to be in computers and I'm going to do awesome stuff. And you give them this first class and they just have all these horrible debugging slogs and they don't actually get to do anything creative. It was horrible. This is, by the way, the SICP book that everyone says they like, Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs. That's what this class was. And I would not teach things that way at all, at all. I think they've rewritten that book now to use Python or something.
Okay.
I don't know if that's any better in reality, but anyway. So the decision I made early on was there's actually, okay. So when you first implement compile time execution, what are you going to do? You're going to add some statement into the language that says run this at compile time, right? What does that do? Well, maybe it's going to call some functions, right? Where are those functions? Well, they're just like in my program, right? And so the red light, alarm light that went off early on was, oh, there's going to be kind of a mess once programs get complicated, that if you're running things at compile time, like you're going to have some code that you really want to just be compile time code and not in your target program. And if you just have this statement that like run things at compile time, then how do you know? And then when you get to like cross compiling and stuff, like you may have different implementations, right? So like open a file. If you're on, Windows and you're compiling for, ARM, then open a file is going to call a completely different low-level API on the host machine than the target machine. And so you have to have a way to keep this straight, right? And that was clear early on. And so the way that I did that is by having the default, there's a way to make your meta program, right, in a way that's very clear and completely separate from your target program. It can't see the target program at all, right? There are advantages to that. I can work in the meta program and not worry at all that I'm breaking anything about the target program. There's no namespace overlap. So again, one of the big problems that happens in C++, and it's especially weird because they added these namespaces, but the namespaces, I mean, those were in like C++ 11 or something, but the namespaces are implemented exactly the wrong way. So you could still have a conflict between namespace names because the name of the namespace is defined by the person who wrote the header file, not the person using the header file. And so that's a complete disaster. But The problem in C and C++ that you have, as well as many of these other static languages, is again, if you include things and they all contribute things into your global namespace, you can have a name conflict, right? I was very upset one day. I had my own, this was many years ago, but I had my own code base with all this code for doing 3D stuff. And I had my quaternion code, and it used a struct called capital Q quaternion that had to be included everywhere because you do all this math and use it everywhere, right? And then I went to port this to a Nintendo GameCube, and I told this company, I'll port it in a week, man, which I did. I ported it in a week, but the first day and a half really sucked because I went in there and the Nintendo SDK used capital Q quaternion for everything. And you can't change their header files, right? So you have to rename it in your whole code base. And so I had a great deal of frustration with that. I had to name it my quaternion or something, right? In all the files. So I had that kind of frustration a lot. And so we have extreme partitioning between namespaces in this language, and that causes a little bit of friction, but it solves a lot of these problems. So the problems that I'm focused on solving are the problems that you have as your language or as your program gets big and complicated. And that's another thing. Like a lot of people, when they design languages, they're like, oh, won't it be cool if you could do like an if statement like this? And it's like, yeah, but that doesn't solve the big engineering problems. That just feels cool when you're first learning the language, right? And that is one of the frustrations that I had that made me want to do all this work to make a language in the first place, is I looked around and very few people were actually focused on these large scale, high complexity problems, all right? Okay, so the way that works here is probably your most complicated compile time execution takes place in a separate program, essentially, right? And so there's no cross-contamination, there's no namespace pollution. They can have different implementations of everything, but they can also share code very easily if you want. So if you're importing some, what's a good example? Like a string library or something, you can just import that on both sides and use it, and it's fine, right? Okay, but for ergonomic reasons, you also can run things just in your actual main program, right? You can just have a command that says, run this thing and compute these 10 integers that I'm just going to insert as a string or something, right? Because that's a very small thing that's maybe easy. And if you're not that worried about it polluting your program, it's much more convenient to put it at the site where you want to do it as opposed to in this separate program. So then the role of macros, to finally answer the question, the role of macros in all this, is there a convenient way to invoke that kind of compile time execution in a way that the user doesn't have to worry about very much, because they're just calling a macro, they give it some parameters. The macro can say like, okay, what do I want to do? Let me run this thing at compile time, take these results, put them together in this way, and insert that back into the program. And so yes, it is in a sense redundant because you already have compile time execution in this other place. But if I were to remove that facility, I think it would be a lot less convenient to do compile time execution in a lot of cases, but B, the power of the macros would go down incredibly. They would almost be like not worth having anymore if you couldn't do compile time execution, because we would have to add some entirely different macro language for like manipulating things declaratively, and it would have to be incredibly complicated because, like I said, there's all these nodes and all these different types and all this stuff, right? So I don't know, maybe there's a way that you could make it not have that much syntax, but behind the scenes it would have to be doing all this type checking and stuff. And so yes, in a computer science sense, it is redundant functionality, but boots on the ground in terms of what am I trying to program, I think it is the right thing to have it invocable in both places.
Okay. Does it then?
Do you want, let's tune this. Do you want shorter answers or do you want in-depth answers?
That's fine.
Like this?
That's fine. In-depth answers.
It depends how much we need to get through.
In-depth answers are great, but this means that you're up to 5-hour discussion.
We'll see what happens.
Okay. Does it mean then that if you get the macros done so that you're happy with the system, you think it's functional, and you get the other issues on the roadmap, GI becomes open sourced and gets a committee standard and everything that is beloved in the
Okay.
C++ world. What happens next?
Well, there is some vague roadmap that does not have dates attached, but it's in phases. And okay, so phase one is where we are right now, or you could call it phase zero even, which is just, it's a closed beta. We have a bunch of people in the beta using the language. But yeah, it's not accessible to the public, but we don't restrict what anyone does with their code. So, if you search for code that people have written or are sharing, like that's out there. It's just the compiler and the core modules that we ship are just closed for now. Phase, let's just say that's phase one, so that we don't get confused. So phase two will be probably an open beta of the binary compiler, right? Where we're not giving out source yet, but everybody can use the language. And that's actually the biggest step, because once we do that, it becomes a lot more costly to make changes to the programming language that break people's code and all that, right?
Yeah.
And so that's one reason why we're going for so long in this closed beta, and why for these features that you mentioned, like why I feel it's important to finish them before we do that. But so that's the next step after these features get reasonably settled. Now we do have ways, there's a few ways, even in the closed beta, how we accommodate changes. So if we're going to change, let's say we're going to deprecate some syntax or something and change it, right? What we do is we release a version of the compiler, or even a function. Let's take a function in the standard library. We don't call it that, but it's the equivalent. If there's some function we want to get rid of or change to something that works totally differently, first we deprecate it, and there's an official way to do that. Just on the function, we can tag it with a message, and it generates a warning when you compile. And then we just leave it that way through several compiler versions. Like every time you compile, you get a warning, this is going to stop working eventually. And then at some point later, we actually take it out. And so people have a window, right? And so that kind of technique can help even when you're in open beta, but like the more open you are, the more there's going to be people who tried it and wrote some code, and then they got busy for 10 months and then came back, and that version of the compiler, it no longer works, and they're forced to update their code or whatever. So that's one reason why we're waiting a long time. Now, that all that said, the metaprogramming that we have does make it in principle possible to rewrite your program automatically to track features as well, but like we haven't done a version of that like maintains comments in white space and stuff, and so that's not that fun. And that's also like in principle, like um we haven't like actually done that on a very large project like the game that we're working on. We haven't round tripped it through that mechanism, so there's probably all sorts of things that don't get rewritten correctly. But that's another plan that we have eventually, is like you could just run a thing that just automatically converts your features. Okay. So then phase three would be probably, okay. Now during phase two, when we're giving out the binary, there's always some people who are going to be like, look, I want to use this language, but I can't unless I have source to the compiler, because like, look, what happens if you get hit by a bus or something, like you just
Yeah.
die? Our project then doesn't have that clear of a future. It does to some degree, because again, so the same metaprogramming power that I just mentioned can let you do other stuff, like you can automatically transcribe the language to a different programming language in a way that's more robust. So you can have always imagined doing that just from the text files, but that's actually in some cases pretty hard, because it's more than just parsing the syntax. Like you have to know what's a type, like especially if you're converting to C or something, right? And what all these things. And but from a meta program, you can actually do it tremendously more robustly because you actually know the meaning of everything. Like if I use a variable called X, I can tell you exactly where X is defined because we can see from the meta program the linkage between the two. And so there's no ambiguity about name spacing or anything like that, right? Um, okay. But so for those parties during that time, we would probably give like a closed copy of the source, right? Because we want people to feel secure. So, and the point of that would just be like, look, if a bomb goes off where I live, you can still compile the compiler and you're fine. Okay. So then phase 3 would probably be we're publishing the source and maybe we're taking bug reports, but it's not some kind of like community project at that time, right? And the reason I would do that is again, I think so. I think when you have the chef model where the chef is trying to make a very good dish, um, that works very well uh, up to a point, up to a certain point of scale, right? And to be honest, it gets you to a level of quality that I've literally never seen from any community-based open source project, right? And this is going to get all the flames in the comments, but it's also going to get the clicks for you, right? Like the theory behind open source is, hey, you have so many people working on the code, it just can't help but be incredible because all the bugs will get fixed and it'll do all these things. And if you actually look, so Linux is but one open source community, right? But let's just take that Linux user space. It's just incredibly full of bugs and it's very slow. And it doesn't, in general, implement any new functionality really ever. It's just copying old functionality, right? Like even stuff like, so in the beginning, Linux had stuff that might seem kind of new if you weren't that experienced. So like the fact that you could like alt arrow key around or whatever it is to get multiple desktops, and you'd be like, Windows can't do that. And it's like, yeah, but TWM on, on Unix did that in like 1990 or whatever, right? A couple years before the Linux kernel even began. So like all these ideas came from somewhere. And we just haven't seen the ability for creativity to happen with that kind of development. And maybe that's not a surprise, right? Because if you have a large number of people, it's easy for those people to contribute incrementally, but creativity involves whatever, whether it's one person or some number of people, it involves those people steering the project very deliberately into a very specific place. And that becomes harder if you're talking about a bunch of people contributing incrementally. It also becomes harder, even if you're ostensibly in charge of the project, if you're trying to take all these inputs from this big community who's contributing, if those are going in the wrong direction, but you're spending all your time fielding these inputs, then it's like you're trying to push your way through a river that's flowing in the wrong direction and trying to get somewhere. And so I would like to protect against that for some amount of time. But this is forecasting. Like who knows? Who knows how it will go when we actually get there? But I would like to do some amount of time of that. And then at some point, we would certainly probably license it in such a way that people could just fork it and do whatever they want with it at some point. But again, I think that's a big part. So going back to Linux, for example, I think that's a big part of what has killed uh, Linux in a certain way. I mean, obviously Linux is not dead, but it doesn't have momentum and it doesn't really make progress. And that's not unique to Linux either. Like Windows doesn't make progress either, and macOS doesn't make progress anymore either. But I think on the proprietary operating system side, the reason is different. Um, if you look at something like the Linux ecosystem, um, again, there's a tremendous number of contributors, right? But everything is so forked and there's so many different heterogeneous environments. And like everybody's introducing new stupid things all the time that do the same thing as the old stupid thing, but different. So you have to rewrite all the stuff. And then when you do, it does the same thing as the old thing, right? And there's so much of that that like all this effort is extremely diffused and it can't push the thing forward at all. And then again, like I said, it's hard to have imagination in that context. And often it's like, okay, you know, we've all probably just seen some really cool videos of a rocket ship getting caught on a tower, and it's like the biggest, heaviest rocket to fly. I actually don't know if it's a little bit. I think that version is a little bit lighter than Saturn V was, but like the full spec version won't be. Um, but the point being, like, that's not something you get by incremental contribution, right? That's something you get by uh, someone is driving to a specific point, right? And in principle, that should be what proprietary systems are able to do. And they used to be able to do that. But the problem is they're not able to do it either anymore, right?
Yeah.
Unless you start something new in like a small startup company. Like Microsoft is not going to give you the new awesome operating system, right?
Yeah.
Like all this AI stuff, you could in principle design a new awesome operating system, or it would still be terrible while we work on LLMs getting better. But like what that would look like would probably actually be tremendously different from a typical desktop operating system. But nobody's going to do that. They're going to do the Microsoft thing where it's Windows, but we also spy on you by screenshotting things and randomly close your windows sometimes when you didn't want to or something. Like that's how it's going to work. So I don't want to turn this into like, closed source is better than open source or whatever. Even though it used to be, I would say it's still a tie. They're both not making progress. So that's what we're trying to isolate against with this kind of roadmap. But yet at some point we would fork it and let people run it. I don't know that I would be using the public fork at that time. We might well just let our private one diverge, or maybe we just consider the project done. Like I have so many things to work on. Like at some point I just need to hand this off to somebody as well and like do something else and become a more of a minor contributor, because
Okay.
like I've got all these games to design and stuff, right?
Uh,
So
you had
but
to,
that's the roadmap. Is eventually, yes, eventually it would be completely open source on GitHub and you can do your patch requests and whatever, but it'll probably take a while to get there, honestly.
you had the idea to make it paid and remain like closed source.
Yeah.
What happened to that?
Um, well, this was just trying to figure out a way to fund more work on the compiler. And I just don't estimate that anything we would do would have a net positive impact, or I haven't figured that out, right? So right now the open beta is free. That's great. Um, Anytime you charge for things, you get less people using it than
Yeah.
the free people, right? And um, so you cut down on the size of your beta, which is maybe fine, but maybe you get fewer bug reports, and so you don't get to fix the problems as fast. And then how much money do you get? And it's like, well, we have around 800 people in the beta right now. I think it's 790 something or something like that. Not all those people are probably active because I'm not tracking. I don't put spyware in. I don't
Because
track how
I
many
would be
people are
kicked
actually
out.
active.
I
So,
would be kicked out if you did that. Yeah.
yeah. But not even to kick people out, but just to estimate. Like if I wanted to estimate for purposes of doing this computation, how many people are active, right? Uh, like let's say I somehow managed to get $1,000 from every member of the beta, which is a lot of money and wouldn't happen, right? That's $700,000. That sounds like a lot of money, but and it actually would. That would make a big difference if we got that much. because that would pay a decent engineers. It would pay like one decent engineer for like 2.5 years, probably, or two engineers for less time or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And that would make a material difference. But that's not how it would go, right? If I said, hey, the beta is $1,000, there's some people in the beta for whom, like every person makes a different amount of money, and $1,000 means a different amount to those people. And so the people who are uh, who have less disposable money would bail out and all these things, right? And so I don't have the ability to predict how well it would go. Um, so I just also haven't done it because it would just be super risky and weird to do that. I think there are other routes you could do. So, historically, sometimes projects get funded by commercial vendor support or something, right? While we're in a closed beta and nobody can use the language, it's hard to envision that happening, right?
Yeah.
But once it becomes more open, you could sort of picture that in some way. Although sometimes that comes with strings. It's like, hey, we got some money from Electronic Arts, but they really want us to put this one feature in or whatever. And it's like, well, I don't know if I would have done that. So that's a danger. But I don't know. But that's the reason why I haven't done it is because I'm just not sure that it would be a good idea.
Okay.
You know? Yeah.
I rewatched the video the presentation you've done while starting this project of making a new language, and
Yeah.
yeah, you said like C++ ship is done sailing, even though like it's kind of 10
Well,
years.
I tend to be very early on
Yeah.
things, but I think a lot more people would agree with that statement now.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of people are very upset about C++ now, whereas back then, so this, just to put this in context, I believe this was in 2014,
Yes.
this one that you're talking about. That's actually not, so that initial video, I think I made two videos like before I had an implementation. But then I think the third one, like late 2014, like November or something, is an actual demo of the first version of the language. And that's the one that I would recommend people look at if they want to see the early, because these first ones you were talking about are just more like, here's a bunch of ideas I have. And then I think a lot of those were replaced by better ideas later in
Yeah.
development,
Yeah, but they are very inspirational. I found
Okay,
them
yeah,
I
I
found
mean,
them really like, here's this idea, like here's the state of the things now, and here's where
yeah.
we could get to. But yeah, like the
Well, and
syntactically, yeah.
I felt very good when I recorded those videos because prior to that, like at that time, I was still working on our previous game, The Witness, which had been a long project of its own. And I was programming in C++ every day. And I would come in and like I just compiling the game took several minutes, which maybe doesn't sound that long to some people, but like, I had gone from Braid, which I had worked very carefully to keep Braid fast to compile, but like on a laptop in 2008, this game that made several $1 million took 7 seconds to compile on a ThinkPad T42, right? That's what I remember. I was timing it, and it was 7.5 seconds. And then C++ has gotten so bad that on a modern computer, if I open up the old Braid code base, it probably takes longer, even though we're many years later and computers are in theory much faster. It's just the compilers are a lot slower. So there's that. But then The Witness was a bigger, more complicated game with more people working on it, and they're not as careful about minimizing compile time, which if you're not careful about that in C++, it can get away from you really fast because of this problem of you include all the header files many times. So C++ is very pathological, and C has the same problem, but C++ doubled down by putting more. When you do templates and stuff, it naturally wants you to put them in header files, so header files get bigger and bigger. But the problem is it's incredibly stupid in the modern day because you have, let's say, hundreds or thousands of files, and each file includes a bunch of header files, which include a bunch of header files, which include a bunch of header files. All those headers get recompiled for every single file, for every single C file. And then all that debug information gets written into the .o file for that C file. So now you have all these .o files on disk, a small fraction of which is the actual code you wanted to compile, but mostly is debug information for the headers. And then the linker comes along and it has to put all these .o files together, and you have 7,123 copies of the same information, and it has to deduplicate all that down into one, and that takes a lot of time. So you spend all this time generating all the redundant information, and you spend all this time condensing it back down, and that's one of the reasons that C++ programs take so long to compile. And so I was really suffering from that on the Witness at the time. I was like, dude, I'm supposed to be designing this game, but I'm also doing all this programming, and like, it's just miserable. And it's miserable not just because of the C++ part, but also, you end up with all these build processes. So like, we would bake light maps for the world, which is like a way of predetermining where light lands in subtle ways so that the scene looks nicer. And that's being done by some computer, right, offline, or in either in a corner of the room or like in a server farm in Texas or somewhere. And so that's generating all this data, and it takes a bunch of time to like update all that because it's a large amount of bitmap data. And so you come in first thing in the morning, and that's like really tedious. And so then other programmers on the team spend some time writing a little desktop tool to like update your stuff in the middle of the night while you're not there. But then you run the game and it has to like compress the textures because they're not compressed the right format as they pull them down, and that takes time. Or like, you turned that off for several days because you were working on some really gnarly bug and you didn't want things to update and change while you're working on the bug, and then you forget to turn it back on, and then it's not updating. Or like, it updates but the light maps don't draw correctly, whatever. There's all these problems that happen. Like, development, when you start having a lot of binary data, there's a lot of friction and cumbersomeness that comes along with that also, and you have to be very careful to manage that. And so toward the end of that project, we were sort of suffering on both of those axes. So it was not uncommon that I would come in the morning and like, I couldn't really work for like the first 20 minutes or something. And like, when you're being bothered by something and you want to come in and do something, it just sucks to just be like sitting there like, oh,
Yeah.
what am I doing right now?
Yeah.
Right. So but a big part of that I felt was the C++. And so when I made that speech, it was really exciting because prior to that, I felt like most programmers feel. Like, every programmer who's experienced, I think, feels some version of this, right? Like, if you're a JavaScript programmer, you've got your own problems with like npm and like how big the code is getting and whatever those things are, right? Like, because we've built all these systems where we don't have the proper respect for how bad complexity is and how far it runs away with things, and how much it deteriorates our ability to program, right? And so I was just feeling that, and I thought what any programmer thinks, which is like, well, this is just what it is. I can try to do some stuff to try to mitigate the problem, but I can't do anything, right? I am helpless to solve the core problem. And then one day I woke up and said, no, I'm not. I used to make programming languages for fun. In college, I could do that again and do a serious programming language this time. And, actually, in that first talk you're talking about, the first video, I actually bring up, I think, as an option, like, look, it's a lot easier to do this than even a single video game. So you could have a coalition among different people in the games industry. And then I decided not to do that, again, because of all these inherent issues in collaboration. It's like everybody has a different idea, and you have to have all these processes and discussions, and you just move slower. And so I just decided to just do it. And so I had a demo for that third video,
Yeah.
which actually worked very well. But yeah, it was motivational for me, I guess, is the point. Because I woke up and I was like, wait, I don't have to be depressed if I actually do this myself.
I think because you're citing as alternative languages, you're citing their like D, Go, and Rust. And
Yeah.
since then, there's Zik, Odin, C3, Hare, which are all like new languages that are sort of like modern C alternatives
Yeah.
with manual memory management. I feel like you're not alone in this like disinterest with C++. What?
No, and in fact, I think that video. So I know for a fact that at least one of those. Let's not get into language wars and like comparing against, but I know at least one of those, and maybe multiple, were directly inspired by the stuff I was doing at the time, because other people said like, oh, yeah, we could make a language, right? And
Yeah,
then they did their version of what they think it should be, right?
yeah.
And I think, um, you know, I think I would rather have my language than their language for all of those. But that's what you would expect any of these creators of these languages to say. And so we kind of just have to see how all these things mature and play out. But I do think it's much more healthy. Like, this is what computers used to be like, right? Was you had all these people doing all these initiatives, and then at some point, like at some point in the 90s, in the mid to late 90s, when the web took off, that all turned into like innovating on web stuff. And then at some point, it all focused into JavaScript frameworks. Like, that was the only random creativity that happened, was everybody was making JavaScript frameworks all the time. And the problem was, because it was a growing field and like all these web programmers were coming in and were relatively new at programming, they didn't really know the history of all the programming languages and stuff that came before. So they didn't know that they were like mostly doing things that had all these problems that we knew about. Like, yeah, okay, you're making this event driven framework that's actually not going to be that good, even if you do a good job at making things event driven, because event driven isn't actually that good for the following reasons. And just people had to relearn all those lessons, because um if you don't know even recent history, then it can come back and bite you. But And then at some point, even the JavaScript frameworks got hard to make. And then I think we had some years of like literally no creativity. And now we're back in this more positive space. I mean, most of this stuff is trash, to be fair. Like, but now we're in this space where you have a lot of people doing random AI stuff, and they're mostly script kiddies just calling into, Chat GPT's API or whatever. But still, there's some creativity there. And then you have people doing new programming languages, right? And again, most of these programming languages are just largely leaning on LLVM. We use LLVM for optimization, but we actually can build an entire binary without it. Um, and all these things that I was complaining about code being too big and complicated and cumbersome and taking too long to compile and being too big in binary form and all this, that applies just triple to LLVM. Like, we don't even, when we make a debug build of our compiler, um, we don't even link debug LLVM, because it's so hard. Because like the just the .o files and libraries, I think, are gigabytes of data. Like, I'm pretty sure I'm not exaggerating. It was just like, it was such a headache for source control to like pull that stuff down, even if you're not compiling it, that we were just like, no, we're not going to do that. So we do a release LLVM. We update it rarely,
You're gonna
and
you're
that
gonna talk to Chris Latner about it?
at some point, yeah, probably. But I don't. I mean, I don't think he can do anything about that at this point, because it requires and he'll probably disagree with me. He would probably say, no, man, that's when you have a lot of people implementing a lot of functionality, that's what happens, or something. I don't know.
Okay.
Well, we'll see. Stay tuned to
Okay.
see how that conversation goes. But
You
I don't think it's productive to just have a conversation with him where I just say LVM sucks.
uh,
That's not. I tried that via direct email to some people on the LVM team once, and they just didn't reply, and I never heard from them again. So yeah.
in this first talk, you outlined like 5 things that would be like principles for this language, Jai,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was friction reduction, joy of programming, performance, simplicity, and design for good programmers. Can you comment on what do you think you achieved after 10 years with Jai on these pillars?
I think most of those we've nailed. I would say the language is getting a bit complicated in terms of all the features. It's probably more complicated than I would have pictured in the beginning. So I would say simplicity is the only gray area, but that's always something we're looking like. I think step one. So rather than like if you want to build things in the real world, right? If you try to optimize on every axis at once, sometimes that makes the problem way too hard and you just fail, right? And so in terms of these five things, it's like, okay, what is the most important? Well, if we don't get back some of the joy of programming relative to C++ or whatever, then what's the point? If I'm going to be just as miserable using this as C++, then I lost, right? So that's incredibly important. Some like low friction is related to that and all this. Um, Simplicity of the language, things that are simpler are easier to learn and easier to use and easier to write and all that. But simplicity also causes problems, right? So like the scheme language that I mentioned earlier is a extremely simplified Lisp, right? But the simplification causes problems, although a lot of the problems are also problems that Lisp had to begin with. So whatever, right? Um, anyway, the point is just uh, things are more complicated than I would have envisioned in the beginning. They're way, way less complicated than C++, though. Like C++ is, um, I mean, I'm not sure that I know anybody who knows the whole language now. Like that's how complicated C++ is. They're probably, I'm not saying that nobody does, right? But probably a lot of the people who know the language are not getting a lot of real work done in the real world. Because there's just so much stuff in it now. They just kept going and going. I stopped around C++ 11 or 13 or something. I just don't even look at new features from after that time. Um, yeah, but so that's something that I would love to improve on. And so the goal is just to build out the language to the level of expressive power that it needs to be, or that I would like, which it's almost there. Um, but again, like the macros are not as powerful as I would like them to be. They're as powerful in terms of what they can do in the end, but it's just like sometimes it's hard to do it. It's too hard to do the powerful thing. We would like to make it easier. Um, and then, with regard to the stuff like DLLs that you mentioned in the beginning, it's like, okay, there's this friction point that was caused by a very early decision in the programming language, which is having the context. And well, after using that, I think that's a tremendously valuable part of the language, and I don't want to get rid of that. So instead, we have to solve this other problem that was introduced in order to have this level of power everywhere. Otherwise, you only have that level of power like up to the DLL boundary. And then if you call a DLL, you have to say like, no context on all the functions or something. And then that means that some of this power that we've been introducing, like the ability to customize allocators and whatever, cannot cross DLL boundaries. And that adds complexity. And you have to deal with this problem as a programmer, and that sucks, right? And so those are complexities that we would like to address to the best of our ability. And like I've said, we haven't worked out the right answer yet. And so it just takes time. But I think I would say that we've nailed, at least for me, most of those things. And just is the simplicity is a little bit gray. But again, I mean, relative to C++, we're so much simpler. Like if you, I don't even know if you were to write out the full C++ spec, I don't even know how many pages that is now. Um, I guarantee ours is much, much shorter and we do more. That's the thing is we have more expressive power than C++ by a large margin. Because at this point they're trying to like backfill. So one of the proposals is like, how to do better runtime type information, right? And the proposals for this are extremely painful and still kind of suck compared to what we have, which is relatively more straightforward and simple and easy to use and all these things. And so I think on a relative scale, we've been successful there. It's just on an absolute scale, I would have liked the language to have simpler semantics than it has currently. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. I have a last question regarding Jai, and then we can move on.
Yeah.
You cannot answer this question if you don't want to. But
Okay.
I've seen a comment on YouTube, I think, that the name of the language was a speculation. The name of the language was coming from an acronym like just an idea. And this is why it was called Jai.
Here's what I'll say. I'm deliberately leaving it um, ambiguous. And the reason is I don't like, so this is all a pushback against one of the failures that I saw in the open source world, right? And what would happen is you would go on Hacker News or and you would read these titles of people introducing their project, or you even go, this even goes back to computer science research papers. Somebody would say like, you know, blammo in capital letters, colon, an algorithm to do pathfinding faster or whatever. And they always put the name first, like their awesome, cool name that they thought of. And then they tell you second, like what it does. So it's like this really bad, stupid form of marketing that always irritated me because you look on Hacker News and all these projects come up and you're like, I know this thing sucks and doesn't even really do what it was supposed to do and is super slow and crashes half the time on input. But they came up with a really cool name that they're excited about. Like there's this, the culture was a little bit broken, right? The culture was, hey, everybody can contribute. That's the great thing about software. And as long as you contribute and you're excited to be programming, then we're happy to have you. And it's like, well, also though, you should be doing good engineering and you shouldn't put broken like if you put broken things into the world but you advertise them as if they were not broken and you tell everybody use my thing, it solves your problem, you're actually adding pollution. So now somebody who comes along and wants to solve that problem has to do a web search like, is there a library to do the following thing? And there's 17 hits. And like some of these are like a bunch of crap that somebody just put out once and like never even really did it the job to begin with. It's just they were motivated one day and then they posted it and then they got demotivated, right? And it never, and you have to sift through all these things and like try to figure it out. And all these have cool names, right? And so the point was, let me just not have a cool name and not advertise based on. That's also why the name of the company is a weird, awkward thing that's nobody knows what it means, and it's not
I
very
I have a
advertisable. It's a deliberate choice.
specific question regarding the
Yeah.
marketing of the
Anyway,
company.
we'll
But
get there. But that's why. And so I will say it is not a self-deprecating acronym. Like just an idea is such a dumb thing to name your language uh because you're like saying, oh, my thing, I'm not really trying to do anything useful or important. I just had an idea one day, man. Just no, that's not, I will unequivocally state that that is not what it is.
okay,
But we're just being deliberately like non-markety about the name.
okay,
But you have to, at the same time, you have to like type something to run the command, right?
yes,
I could have called it compiler, but then that would have run into namespace conflicts with other things. So,
okay.
and
Right.
it's also more to type.
Do you still say that this is unnamed language and it can change? The official name will be different,
Yeah,
or
maybe.
okay,
I don't know. That's not too serious either. It's just the most important thing to me is that the semantics of the language are strong. Like the syntax even is like, I don't care that much about the syntax, right? We changed some of it recently, but it's mostly the same. Um,
with the
you know,
Christmas Christmas beta edition where you created like 3 different ways to do the casts just so people
Yeah.
can experience different ways. Okay.
Yeah, that was a fun little thing to do. It only took a few hours on one day to do that, and I was just like, all right, let's just try it, and then we'll delete most of those ways later, and it'll be fine.
Okay. Let's close the Jai section and start the game section, but maybe we can take the break. Couple of minutes break.
Okay. Yeah, I'll refresh my tea.
What is the status of the game? Also unnamed, or sometimes called Sokoban, or sometimes
Yes.
called Game 3 for like the older people.
No, game 3 is a different game.
So this is another question. Like you had
This
in
is
your
game
Twitter
4.
bio that you're working
Yeah.
on 2 games, but all of the
Yes.
Sokoban stuff is one game. Where's the other one?
Okay. Well, okay, so for a little bit, the other game was the anniversary edition of Braid. That was, if you looked at my
Okay.
Twitter bio last year, that was the other game. But
Okay.
since then, that has shipped, and we now have another game. It's kind of on pause right now. It's unclear whether we will finish it or not. It depends on business business randomness that is happening right now.
Okay.
But it is a virtual reality music oriented game.
Oh,
And that's using the same engine as the Sokoban game. We just sort of ported it. We copied it over and, um, you know, deleted all the gameplay code, and then you just have the engine there still. Which, by the way, is a similar thing. I guess we haven't mentioned this, but part of the whole plan related to open sourcing the compiler is around that time, or maybe before, to the closed beta people, we'll be releasing our full game engine, um, which is nice because it's actually a commercial quality thing. Like right now, if you download the beta, there's examples of games and all that, right? So we give people code that where it's very easy to just like open a window and start, or there's like the invaders example, which was in one of those early videos, which plays music and reads the controls, and you could play a game and it's all there, and you could start with that and edit it and change it into whatever you want. But those are not full scale commercial quality, modern graphics API things. And so this other engine that we're going to release eventually is all that. And yeah, so we essentially did a trial run at stripping the game and the engine apart, and did that to bootstrap this game. It runs on the MetaQuest 3, right? So that involves cross compiling to a different CPU and different operating system, Android on ARM, and it all works great. And you can. It's not a very complete or polished game, but you can put on the headset and use the controllers and play a game that does all the things it does,
okay.
controller tracking and plays audio and all these things.
But does is it planned to be as like a commercial game with actual
Yes,
things, or is it like a
that was
simulation thing?
no. It was the plan was that it would be a commercial game, and uh, I just don't know. I would like to do it eventually, even if this business randomness does not resolve. But that may just change the schedule by a lot, because if we can have funding for it, that just means we can hire an additional programmer or two who can work on that, right? And if we don't have, between this other game and the compiler and all that, I have a lot to do, and I have more programming to do than I would like to do. I also need to design. So right now on the Sokoban game slash game 4 slash all this stuff, I am working on the ending right now, and that's in sort of very intensive design process. And so that's time that I can't spend programming either when I'm designing that. Or sometimes I'm doing gameplay programming in support of the design, because it's much easier to implement your own design than to try to talk to somebody
Yeah.
who will do the things that you say. Like if you want to be a game designer, It's very much more powerful to know how to program. Even if you're not like a good programmer, right? Even if you just do scripting or whatever, it's way better than if you're like a helpless designer who can't make things happen. But anyway, so that's the situation there is like, would I like to do that game eventually? Yes. So what happened was the way this started was more than a year ago. Uh, I just tried out the Quest 3 because I was like, I just want to keep up with what's happening in virtual reality. And I was just really impressed by how good it is. Like it doesn't require, like previously I had used like the Valve Index kind of thing or whatever, HTC Vive, whatever. And that has all these base stations that you have to set up. And I just wouldn't end up maintaining that because it's annoying. Um, but it's very easy to put on, and the tracking is approximately as good. It's not quite as good, I think, as the those base stations provided on the Valve stuff, but it's almost as good, and it's untethered, which is the big difference. I mean, I bought a wireless radio for the Vive, but like I never hooked it up, and it probably wasn't that good. But it's just a really great experience. And my big disappointment in that sector is I just think all the games are not very creative. Like VR game developers have not figured out how to do the design to make their games so interesting that people want to do that. Because there's plenty of good games you can play without putting on a helmet, right? So if you're going to put on the helmet, there needs to be a reason. And a lot of the time, people think that reason is, oh, it's so immersive because of VR. And like, I don't think that's a real reason. But I think there are game mechanical things by which a game can differentiate itself and you could have an experience that's very different from what you could have just on your desktop. And I think game designers have not been very good about figuring out what that is. And I don't exactly know what those things are, but this game was my way of like wanting to go in there and explore and figure it out. But the thing is, like I said, I have limited programming bandwidth. So it relies on, having other people do the programming. And right now, that part is in limbo.
Okay. Okay. So, can you tell me about the scope of Game 4 slash Sokoban?
Yeah,
Because I've heard and saw sort of statistics about like
yeah,
the scope of this game, which seemed incredibly huge.
it is very huge. Um, it is probably the biggest, like, if we're going to say like handcrafted, high quality puzzle game, right? If that's a category, this is easily the biggest one of those ever made by some integer factor, right? That I don't know what that factor is. There are some other, so the game has, we don't know. We're actually going through and editing and cutting out levels right now because there's too many, and you want to keep the best ones, right? It's a level-based game where you wander around an overworld and then you go into specific levels. Actually, do you want to do a screen share? This is an overworld that you wander around and you go into all the levels, right? So you like go up a screen and then you go. Right now we're loading shaders, so it's janky, but you go into these individual levels, right, which are just little puzzle solving experiences. And then the complexity of the overworld is something like that, except it's actually bigger than that. And then every one of the little like yellow stars that you see is an entire level that you can go into. And then as I should turn off the music, huh? That's probably bad for.
It wasn't streamed,
Oh, okay. Anyway, so these are some levels that we've been working on lately just to show off the visual style of the game,
which is really
right?
nice, by the way.
And so, it's like classically a Sokoban game is about pushing stuff around, and solving the puzzle, which in this case is I got to get my character to the exit, which is here, right? And so these are just some, obviously I don't want to go explaining all the mechanics, but this is sort of our current favorite level in terms of how it looks.
Yeah.
I just like a lot of things are successful here. like just the lighting off the red tiles and the border around it and the cool background and all that. Um, but we have a bunch of levels that look good. Let me find another one. Some of them are like less done than others. Um, oh, that one's been updated recently. That looks pretty cool.
And
Um,
in your Sokoban game, you can control also like couple characters, right? And you get different
yes,
kind of abilities.
yeah. So there's probably 10 characters in the game total. Okay, this is another one that I think looks really neat. So this is a different character. This is the wizard, and he can teleport. Well, actually, so if I go over here, he can like teleport swap with this block, right? That's his power. He doesn't have to cross all the squares in between. So yeah, okay. So that'll give you an idea. So this is one level, right?
Yes.
And uh, there's on the order of 800 levels. There might be
Okay.
fewer than that really in the end, or more. I don't know. But there's on the order of 800 levels. And then there's that overworld that takes you to all of them. And a lot of the levels fit on one screen, but some of them don't. Because part of the idea of the game is we're playing around with different mechanics. And some of the mechanics involve um, large, complicated levels that have many puzzles in them. And so if you count the number of actual puzzles, it's well over 1,000. Um,
Okay.
you know, I don't even know. It's probably like 1,200, or it depends on what you call a puzzle and all these things, right? Um, but it's big. It's big. I estimate so far, I think it's a reasonable estimation that if someone wants to 100% a game, 100% the game, um, if they're an average person, it's probably over 500 hours of playtime. That's my guess.
Okay.
Uh, Someone who's really good at puzzles could probably do it faster than that. But for example, we had a playtester play an earlier version of the game. He didn't even 100% it, right? Because a lot of it was still rough. This was more than a year ago. Um, he played and recorded playtesting videos for us, and I think he played about 130 hours. Um,
Okay.
before we were like, okay, you're at the super rough part of the game. And oh, this isn't just a puzzle enthusiast. This is somebody who makes puzzle games, who has thought about puzzles a lot, right? And so for him, it would have been probably around 300 hours at least to 100% the game,
Okay.
right? Like, we don't know though, because literally nobody has ever. Well, we're not done yet, but so nobody has ever played through all the things not having seen them before. I mean, obviously I could play through, but I know the answers to a lot of things, so it's a lot faster.
Yeah. Uh,
Anyway, though,
I
it's really big.
I wish I checked the stats for with the witness to compare. Do you know them? Like
Um,
how much time would you need for?
so I think again, it depends. If you're completionist and you're really interested in all the details and you're not a hyper fast puzzle solver, I think it's 80 to 100 hours. Um, People who are really fast and good at puzzles, I believe I've heard of people doing the game in like 30 to 40, right?
Okay,
When they're like puzzle enthusiasts,
that's
right?
wild. Okay.
Yeah. So, and probably there's some people who did it even much faster than that, right? Because there's nothing in the game that artificially, I mean, there's speedrunners who can do the game incredibly fast once they know the
Yeah.
answer to all the puzzles and stuff, and they skip around lots of things. But the point being, so if that's accurate, if you say it's 80 to 100, this game is like 5 times as big or something in terms of how much there is to play. At least it's really big.
Well, how did the development look like because of the language? Like you were both developing the language and the game at the same time. So like did you
Yeah.
stop the game to change the language or like did you need to
Not
update?
not really. I mean, here's the thing. The So that first uh, demo of the programming language I gave was in late 2014, I think. And at that time, it was a full programming language that you could use. Like, obvious, like I demoed a little video game in it, right? Um, but there was some stuff that was kind of hacked together and not really good. Like at that time, okay, so interestingly, when I gave that original talk, I knew that it was going to be manual memory management. I think I was pretty clear about that in the talk. It wasn't going to be garbage collected, but I wasn't sure about other things. Like I wasn't sure that it was going to be a systems programming language um, that would let you fully access operating system APIs, or whether it was going to try to be high level in some way. And so that initial demo that I showed, when it opens a window and stuff, um, it was actually calling into a C library that I had pre-written that did all the Windows API stuff. And I was like, maybe that's going to be how it is. And you just interface with these higher level things, or maybe it's just literally a low level programming language. And we made it eventually a low level programming language. But so some of that happened in 2015, right after this demo and all that. But I was still working on the witness, right, until literally January of, well, really March of 2016, because you always have to do support when a game comes out and fix things and whatever. So, um, but at that time, so I started this game around the middle of 2016, which was a really long time ago now. But part of the reason for that is I've been doing this plus the programming language plus the Braid Anniversary Edition, all three of those things. And plus running the company, like, making business deals and figuring out who to hire and all these things, right? So that all takes time. So, but at that time, in the middle of 2016, the programming language was already in an early version of its modern form. It just, I would say, it was not as industrial strength as it is now, right? It didn't have all the features that it has now, for sure, but also some of the features, they had little bugs or little things that I knew they wouldn't handle. But because I was the only person writing code in this language, it didn't matter. I knew and if I had a problem, either I would just work around it really quickly or I would just skip it or whatever. But then also I did spend a lot of my time from 2016 to 2020 working on the compiler, but also a lot setting up the game. So, we did a whole new game engine from scratch. We ported over some of the Witness engine, but a lot of it was new, really more than a lot more. I didn't want to do a real engine going into this project, and we did a real engine for some reason. And
But
so,
when you ported, you needed to switch it from C++ to Jai, right? For the witness part.
yeah, and we didn't do that with very much code.
Okay.
Um, but like a lot of the editor we ported over, like the gameplay is nothing alike, right, between the games. But a lot of the editor, and then we wrote a new renderer for a more modern API because the Witness was targeting like a DirectX 10 or 11 class API, which is still in this older style where it's more of an abstraction barrier. And then a more modern API like DirectX 12 or Vulkan, um, you do a lot of things. You're like allocating buffers on the GPU manually, and that's a big difference, right? It lets you do a lot more things, but it's a big difference. So we essentially did that from scratch, and all this stuff. Like I ported over my animation system that I had written for the Witness, like for character and object animations, but I made it better and I added a thing. So in the Witness, you couldn't really like we only had one character and it was your shadow. So like we didn't work very hard on animation blending or having a lot of different animations for a character. And then there was machines where we would sort of, if you take an elevator up and then you reverse it, that's actually all playing animations because you have little wheels in the elevator and stuff.
Yeah.
And we would just like seek through and find the right time to reverse it and all that. But it becomes different when you have a game that's character focused and it's like, oh, is he running and idle and whatever, and you want to blend through all these things. And so I made a little data driven declaration language for an animator to use to control what happens and all that stuff, right? So there was a lot to do. But yeah, like the programming language was already far enough along that it was mostly fine. But I also kept upgrading it over that time. And then I think our first beta was in the beginning of 2020. Is that right? It was, let me go to our change log. Yeah. So I believe it was like January 1st, 2020 was the very early beta. And that was just, 15 people or something. The beta was very small. And then we just have been gradually
Okay.
growing it.
How, when did other people join you on the Sokoban game?
From the beginning, because we already had a company
Okay.
from shipping the witness, and it was like, I don't remember how many full-time versus part-time we had, but it was about 12 people or 14 people. And we had an office in San Francisco and we were just doing our things.
Okay. Okay. So what about the release? When will when will it come out?
Um, we have not announced anything yet.
Okay.
However, um, I would say uh, I want it to be not a lot more than a year from now, which sounds like maybe a long time if you're like waiting for a new game to play, but that's very quick compared to how long development has been. Now, if we do that, it'll still mean it was almost 10 years from the time the project was started, which is just incredibly long. And we can't do that anymore because I will be dead. So, but now that we've got a new engine and a new programming language and all this stuff, um, most of that doesn't need to change for future games, right? And so we can just build on this foundation that we've got to do new stuff after. And so the game 3, which you've seen mentioned, the idea behind this game, by the way, this huge 500-hour game, it was supposed to originally just be a small game that we did really fast. Um, and then we would go on, it would be to prep the engine so we could use the engine for game 3. But then the engine got a lot bigger and the game got a lot bigger. And it's just always harder to do things than you thought that it was going to be. That's the reality of game development. And so all those things conspired to mean that it's not done yet. But man, this game is really something. It's really big. And then hopefully when we release the engine, people will really appreciate it too. Like we're not going to release it in a product kind of way. So it's not going to be like a competitor to Godot or something, because it's oriented in a different way. So like Godot is trying to be like Unity, right? Where you can make a game through the UI and you don't really necessarily have to know how to program. Maybe you write a little bit of the scripting language or something, right? Um, this engine is not like that at all. It's a very programmer-centric engine, which is good if you're a programmer who wants to be in control of how things work, because you don't have this big legacy of stuff that is hard to modify. Um, but it also means that it's just you don't build a game in quite the same way. So it's got an editor in the game, like you run the game, and you have an editor that lets you edit entity fields and all that, but it's inside the game. It's not outside the game like it is in Unity and Godot, right? And but what that means is you're in control of it and you can do whatever you want with it. And we'll see how that's received
Okay.
at the time. So actually, if you're going to count all the things that I've been doing, right, it's really like at least 4 things, because it's the engine, the game, the Braid Anniversary other game, and the programming language. And then, I mean, if you really want to get picky, probably the programming language and then the user space libraries that are in the modules folder are probably kind of 2 things, sort of. So I don't know. I don't know how many things that is. I'm just trying to feel good about it taking 10 years.
How much does it take to compile? How much time does it take to compile now from scratch? The
The
game,
game,
yeah.
it's longer than I would like. It's about 1.7 seconds on my laptop if we're building using our own backend. If we use LLVM in a non-optimized build, right, just a debug build, it probably takes another 2 seconds or 3 seconds more than that. My goal for the final compiler speed is that we want to be able to do 1 million lines per second on a desktop machine, and we're probably a little less than 10x slower than that right now. 10x sounds like a lot, but we haven't really tried to optimize it very much. Like once in a while, I go in and try to make it faster, but like I said, I have a lot of things to work on. And so most of the work has just been making the features go. And so between just making it faster in a regular scalar way, I think we could get at least 2x or 3x just from that. And then you could think about parallelizing it more. There is some parallelization in the compiler, but the hard part, which is the type checking, is not parallel right now at all. So it's a huge bottleneck in the middle.
Okay. Okay. I have a couple of questions regarding Thekla, your company.
Sure. Yeah.
First of all, maybe how your company operates. Like how many people? Is it now remote? Because it's
We are now remote. We were local
yeah.
Before COVID. And then a combination of San Francisco made it illegal to be in your office for 8 months. But also I became fed up with California and San Francisco generally, and so did many other people. And so a lot of people just moved away during that time. There was also some other stuff that happened. So, okay. So one of the things that we got kind of blindsided by let's take a longer time frame, like between the time when I started The Witness, which was around 2009, and today, right? One of the things that's happened is because we've had this big technology boom, including all the internet companies and all this stuff, the price of programming has gone way, way, way up, right? So back in 2009, I would hire people for a salary of around $150,000, and that felt pretty high to me. And like now, that's very low. Like if you like by California salaries, if you're expecting to pay someone $150,000, I mean, there's also been some inflation, but if you're expecting to pay someone $150,000, that's like a junior person or someone not that skilled or something, right? And the problem is we don't have a giant fountain of free money the way that like Google or Facebook or these companies have. And so they can afford to pay incredible amounts of money to people. So this was another thing that we had, was just during COVID. So we started out being remote because we had to, but then we were remote because it was like, well, everybody's moving out of California. Let's just be remote for a while and see how that is and not reopen our office. And that worked in some ways, but there's a lot of negatives to it. And if I could do it a different way, if I could go back to an office and have everybody there, I would much prefer that. Even though I don't like working in an office myself, everything works better when you do that. But so we've been remote since 2020, and it also was a natural time. There were some people who just moved on to other jobs at that time because it was a time when people were making a lot of big life changes. And then also some of these people had been working at my company for like 10 years, right? And even if something's a really good job, like 10 years is a long time. And you're just like, I kind of want to go do something else. Oh, gee, I heard that some people at Meta are making $600,000 a year. And like, I just got married and are having a kid, and my priorities change. Like all these things, the mixtures of all these things happen. And so really, between 2020 and now, we're a small team to begin with. The team size has gone up and down. Like it's probably been averaged around 12. We're a little bit lower than that now because we had some layoffs this year, or in 2024, which was a notorious year for layoffs in the game industry. But I think we only have 2 people in the company, including me, who were there in 2020 at this point. Like that's how much turnover there's. It was just a very disruptive time. But that's been like that didn't all happen at once. It happened in many phases. But we have a really good team now for finishing up this game, and it feels good. We've just had a couple of meetings. once it ticked over into 2025 and it's like, okay, this is the year when we mostly finish the game. We want to be basically kind of done with it at the end of the year. Like you just click into a different mode and things get more serious,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So, how does the language slash game engine slash game split looks like inside the company? Like, if you hire somebody, like, do you hire for
Yeah.
language or for game, or does it get changed?
No, I mean, I would like to hire for the language eventually. This was one of the things that I was hoping when the Braid Anniversary Edition shipped. The plan was that that would make enough money surplus above what we need to run that I could just hire one or two people to work on the language full time. And it didn't make that much money. It made money, it's profitable, but it's not profitable enough to be able to hire people to put on something that's what would you call it? Like a it's just not a profit generating product, right? We're not selling the compiler. Um, so right now we do have so I work on the compiler sometimes, and then there's Raphael, who's a dude who's known to the people in the beta who works on it part-time. Um, and then that's kind of it. So it's very little manpower for like a C competitor language, right? Like if how many people at Microsoft work on that C++ compiler, right? Or whatever. I'm sure it's a lot. Or how many people work on the Go compiler, right? To pick a more modern language. It's probably a lot still, even though that language has kind of stabilized. I bet there's a big team on it, right? And so it's kind of crazy to be doing this with like two people working on it part-time, but that's what we're doing. Um, I would like to put, um, as soon as it becomes feasible, I would like to put more people on the compiler. And that might be something that happens sometime in the middle of 2025 because business fluctuates all the time. And if something happens that's really good, we might be able to do that. But like, so 2024, people not in the games industry may not know this. I alluded to layoffs earlier. 2024 is pretty much seen by most experienced people as the worst year for the video game industry in the entire history of the video game industry that anyone has been alive for. Like including there was a very notorious, I forget what year, like in the 80s sometimes there was like an Atari console cartridge or crash when you could go into the store and buy those cartridges for 25 cents. Like this was even worse than that. Just in terms of how many companies went out of business and how many had layoffs and how many are still going to have layoffs because it hasn't totally ended. But I think in 2025, the economy is starting to pick back up and we'll see. We will see. But, not to get too much into business, but the way this will reflect on the compiler is if things get good again, we could afford to spend more on it. And, with regard to the game, the Sokoban game, that's what most people in the company are working on right now, because that's the thing that's expected to make some money. And then there's this VR project, which also I said there are business uncertainties attached to that, but that would also be something that we expect to make money off and that we have significant people on. But yeah, the compiler is, we do a lot with a little on the compiler,
Yeah.
is how I would describe it.
Yeah. How do you hire people?
You know, I don't think we've been careful enough about hiring people, is one thing. And maybe it's just because it's very hard. Some of these big companies put people through a big interview process that lasts a week and many, many meetings, and then they still hire people who aren't good. So I don't know that that really fixes anything. Um, we've had a mixture. I mean, we've had some very good successes hiring people, um, like who are just very good, and you just couldn't imagine having anyone better in that position. And we have a couple such people at the company right now, and that's great. Um, and then, you know, uh, hopefully you land, like that's more than you can really ask for when you get that. But mostly what you hope for is just people who are going to do a good job and, care about working on the game and do a good job on the game and are, productive and do great. And that's mostly what we have now.
Okay.
uh After the, because like I said, we had a little bit of a layoff, and when you have a layoff, you try to insulate, you try to make it's very hard. I hope nobody listening to this ever has to do this. um but you try to make the decisions that are going to make the company come out the best after the layoff, right? But you would have preferred to not have to do it in the first place.
Yeah.
But uh yeah, I mean, we've also, so that's great that we have good people. But we've also had to fire people, right? Or there have been a number of times when, when somebody's obviously not doing well, you do a thing where you communicate clearly with them and say, look, we don't think you're doing that well. We need to put you on some kind of performance improvement thing, or have higher expectations. And very often when people have options, they will quit shortly into that process because of whatever reason. Because maybe if the problem is they're only working at home for 1 hour a day because it's a remote thing, maybe they don't want to work more than 1 hour a day and they figure they can do that at some other company, right? Maybe they're actually working 3 jobs and aren't telling you, and that's why they're only working 1 hour a day, right? This is one of the hard things about the remote scenario, is because I can't really see what's happening from, because we don't install any of this invasive spyware on people's machines or whatever. I don't ever want to do that. Although who knows, at some point it may become financially infeasible to run a company without doing that, but we don't do it. So if someone, if it looks to me like someone's working for an hour a day, I kind of have to believe that that's actually what's happening. Like, because otherwise, like someone who is legitimately, like, let's just say there's some bad actor who is legitimately exploiting you and knows that, right? If you say, look, you're just not that productive, can we work to get that up? I mean, they're just going to say, oh yeah, sorry, the code base is complicated, I have trouble understanding it. Or they're going to start blaming you. They're going to be like, oh, this code sucks, and it should be higher quality, whatever, right? They're not going to say, oh yeah, I'm only working an hour a day because I'm also working these 2 other jobs, right? And so it's an inherently low trust environment, and I don't like that. But we've definitely had cases where there were people legit only working an hour a day, and we just had to deal with that by, straight up firing them. Or, I mean, we've had cases of some people who would do like an hour every 2 weeks. And because I wasn't directly, I don't know, we were just giving them a lot of chances to improve. Like during COVID, especially, it was an unhappy time, and people have enough difficulties in their lives and stuff. And you try to just be very lenient. But you also, the company will go out of business if people don't program,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So you just eventually you need to put your foot down and say, like, dude, we need you to do stuff. And so we've had to shorten all of this. We've had a bunch of that as well. Like, I'm not even, if anyone is out there thinking I'm talking about them, I'm thinking of at least 4 different people right now, right? Like, that's how many times this has happened. So hiring is hard, is just, what I'm trying to say.
Do you see any
Um,
correlation between like the stuff people say or do during the interview and then performing nicely afterwards?
I think there is. I think when you get someone who's really at the high end, and they're programming because they really legitimately enjoy programming, and they have a lot of good experience, and they um and they've done significant things before. You can tell that in the interview questions. So you can start talking to them and you can get really into details about what they did. And they'll have interesting answers and they'll be able to tell you the details. This is a okay. So one of the things that happens at bigger companies is you'll have a team of several programmers who worked on some feature or system. And in reality, like one or two of those people carried most of the weight, and then the rest of them were just sort of hanging on, right? And how do you tell the difference? Because on the resume, those people's titles and job descriptions look the same, right? How do you know? And the way that you know is you just start talking. If you're technically literate, you can't do this if you're not technically literate, but you just start talking to them like, oh, you wrote the collision detection system for this game engine. Like, what kind of primitives were you colliding with? Oh, okay. So did you do an early out check where you check a looser bounding, like a big sphere with multiple things inside, right? What did that look like? And then how did you prevent the overhead of that from being too large? And what did you have any cache coherency problems? And how did you get around that? Did you like reorient the way the data structure was stored? You can just go further and further, and you don't ask a preset list of questions. That's the thing, because that won't work. You have to dynamically tailor it to what they're talking about, and you have to have enough of a clue about what they're talking about to ask good questions and then to understand if the answer is good, right? And so that's really the art of the interview. So there's a video on YouTube that I always thought was pretty good that illustrates this. It's Casey Muratori doing an interview with Sean McGrath. It's not a real interview. It's like a mock interview, but it's really long. It's like 90 minutes. And it's just him asking Sean about what he has done.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's a very good example of how to interview a technical person. Now, I also interview like artists and stuff, right? 3D artists, modelers, and stuff. And I don't have as deep of domain knowledge there. I've been in games a long time, and so I can ask some decent questions there, but I'm not going to be able to ask questions that are as good as the ones that I'm able to ask about programming. And that's just a limitation there. I have to trust when we hire someone onto the art team, I have to trust to some degree that the other people on the art team have vetted that person in a reasonable way. But okay, so apart from that telling you technical ability, asking these questions, it also does tell you about motivation to a reasonable degree, because you can hear in someone's voice, how are they talking about these things? Are they interested? Are they proud of this solution that they had, right? Or are they just like burned out and trying to get through the interview and like don't really ever want to program again in their life? Like you can tell these things, and that helps. But even so, it's just hard. Like, I mean, to be fair, a lot of the times when we've had these severe problems with like people just not really doing anything, it was where we had a shorter interview process where we were being less. So we would do a little bit of this question and answer like I was talking about, but I never would like super grill people. But I'm going to switch to doing the 90-minute version. And that's why I say we need to interview better, because I do think, like, again, there's this like wanting to be nice to people and wanting to assume like, oh, you worked at some big game company like Electronic Arts or Epic for 5 years. Surely you did a good job and were exposed to all the knowledge around games and all that. And then you ask some cursory questions and they have pretty good answers, and or okay at least answers, and I don't go into that much detail because I don't know that much about how that system worked or whatever, and then that person just ends up bad. So it's hard. It's hard, but I would encourage people to watch that YouTube video and use that method, because I'm going to go more and more in that direction. I don't think you want to sit there and quiz people with like leet code questions or whatever, because that doesn't really tell you if they're actually good. Although I do think there's a place for one or two of those, maybe to start things out. Or more often you can organically integrate those into the question and answer process. So, for example, when I was talking about the collision detection question, you could be like, oh, did you use a tree structure for that? Or did you use like a grid? And if they give you the answer, like, oh, we used a tree structure, I would say, why didn't you use a grid? Did nobody think about it? Was there a reason you wanted to use the tree? Was there some property of it? Right. And you're starting to get to this deep knowledge around trees, and not just like, did this person memorize how to do the breadth first search? Right. Like there was this thing going around Twitter the past week about like, here's the programming question that I ask. And if someone can't answer this, it's a no hire. And it's like a very simple binary tree. And it's like print out each
Yeah,
horizontal
yeah,
level
yeah,
of
yeah.
the tree on one line. Right. And it's very easy, even if you have never encountered the problem before, if you understand trees, you should be able to answer this in like 30 seconds, unless you're totally flustered, right? And there's a couple different ways to do it, even, which is the silly thing. But you know, everybody got enraged about it. Like, what do you mean? I write all this software, I don't know anything about trees. And it's like, oh man, that's just where we have this every 5 years or something. There's a big flare up about people being pissed off that they program all kinds of JavaScript and don't know anything about data structures, right?
Yeah,
But those kind of questions are very artificial, but you can get to them very naturally if you're conversant in the subject matter to begin with.
yeah. Okay. There are game studios that try to brand the game studio itself, and I feel like
Yeah.
Thekla is at the opposite end.
Yes,
And
that's intentional. It's maybe a mistake, because maybe I would like to make more money. And if you had studio brand, I mean, what happened is de facto, I sort of became the recognizable brand, right?
yes,
Because people who played the previous games and want another one are like, where's this dude's next game? So maybe it didn't help to have the company have a weird name. But that was, I was very explicitly thinking that. It's like, I don't want this to be a company that's about the brand of the company. And in retrospect, maybe that's a mistake.
because like if you open the witness,
Yeah.
you don't see like Thekla logo.
Oh, that part. Yeah. Well,
You
that's related but different. The new game is going to be like this also, by the way, unless somehow we sign with a publisher that forces us to put a splash screen on. So this has happened in rare cases. Um, like if we sign with a publisher and they have in the contract, you must put our screen up when the game starts, then we would probably put our own up, because at that point you've already disrupted the player experience.
yeah,
And so why should we let the publisher have more branding than
yeah,
we have? Right? But if we don't have to, then the plan is for this game to just drop you directly into the game. So to be clear, both Braid and The Witness, it's not even just that there's no splash screen. There's no main menu or anything.
yeah.
Like, you go directly into the game. And that's sort of an artistic statement, but it's also just sort of a, like, look, if my job as a designer, I mean, here's the thing. You'll go on the internet and all these people are like teaching you how to design games, right? And it's all monetization, which is a word that I hate, or like how to be viral or something. And like, okay, all that stuff's fine, but, or it's not really fine because it's very corrosive, but like, if, do you want to make something really good or not? And if you want to make something really good, your number one priority has to be the experience of the player, right? The main reason for you making this thing has to be to make an interesting or fun or mind expanding or whatever kind of experience for the player. That has to be the number one item on the list of all the things you consider anytime you're making a decision, right? And then how does that play out into other parts of games? Like, if I'm trying to give you a good experience, why would I make you wait longer to start the game so that you watch an advertisement for my studio, which, it's not even a real it's like a logo is like brainwashing, right? Because I'm not telling you I'm not telling you why my studio is good. I'm forcing you to get the impression in your brain of the name and the image. And that's actually the opposite. That's a parasitic relationship where you're using the player's brain like as a resource that you're trying to extract something from. And I try not to do that to the greatest extent possible, which is why we don't have this kind of branding, right? And it's another reason. But we don't really have it anywhere. So like if you run the witness, you can hit escape to pop the menu up. We don't have a company logo there either. It's just the menu that lets you do the things, right?
Yeah.
If you look in the credits, well, okay, there's no credits screen in the witness. The credits is a thing that you only get to by working very hard to get to the end of the game. Um, and in there, you maybe will hear the name of the company, right? So it's really buried. It's really buried.
It's like a secret of its own.
Yes, yes. I mean, you can look it up on because sites like Moby Games or whatever extract the credits and post them. But yeah, I've always been very anti that because I've always been very much about the goal of this is to make the best experience that we can, given our limited capacity as human beings to do what we can do. And it's just so much of the games industry veers away from that very quickly. And I just, it makes me sad. It makes me sad.
So it ties into my next question, which was, how do you view your task as the game designer? Is there something more than like creating the best experience possible for the player?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very vague and general statement, right? And so when you start a new game, that new game is about something, like there's some core idea to it, hopefully. Maybe it's just a fun game mechanic. Like I'm going to make a tactics game where the combat's interesting and like maybe I like XCOM, but I want to make it different. Like that's a very game mechanical reason, but that's still good enough. So then you say like, okay, making a good experience is about making sure these mechanics really work and not getting in the way of them. Making sure, like if I'm doing a tactics game and you want to make good decisions, I want to make sure the scene is readable so I can see everything that matters. And unless I'm making some statement and the game is more about the confusion of war, and then that's a different rubric on which to make decisions, right? But whichever one of those things you pick to start with then becomes your basis for making decisions going forward. And so sometimes it's game mechanical like that. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes it's more philosophical. So like in The Witness, there is a core idea to the game that I won't spoiler, although you could very easily spoil yourself searching the game on the internet now. But there's a core idea behind the game that uh, is sort of prior to mechanics a little bit. It determined the mechanics, but it's more fundamental than that. And that drove all the decision making in the game. It affected the puzzles. It affected the art style. Like The Witness has very bold colors with not a lot of high frequency detail. And the reason is because of this core philosophy that's behind the game. But that reason was not in play in Braid, and it's also not in play in the new game. And so all these games look different from each other because they're doing different things, right? And so as long as you have a very concrete goal, then for any decision you have to make, you can say, does this help me achieve that goal or does it make it harder? Or is it orthogonal? Very few things are completely orthogonal, but you could be like, is it mostly orthogonal? And then once you have that, um, that helps you make your decisions. And it doesn't only help you make the decisions in an intelligent way, but it helps you make a set of decisions that globally are coherent with the point of the game. It's like a ferrous magnet where the reason it has magnetism is because the little pieces of it are aligned, right? You want your game to be that way. You want the pieces to be aligned to create this magnetic field that's strong. You don't want them to be misaligned and create nothing. And so that's one very important piece of how that is done, I think.
So what when you are the one who's designing the game, what kind of things you're searching for?
That changes every game, right? So in the new game, part of what we're doing is we're exploring the space of game design that you get when you intentionally create a combinatoric. Oh, I just spilled my tea. When you intentionally create a combinatoric explosion. So, this is a thing that game designers have known happen for a long time. Is that you could take a couple different mechanics. You can just make up any mechanic that you want. Like, oh, my guy has a grappling hook, or I could double jump, or I can zoom in and aim that way. Like, these are all different things. And then game designers have known for a long time that you get this very interesting phenomenon when game mechanics interact with each other as opposed to being orthogonal. Like, if they're totally orthogonal, well, okay, let me not use the word orthogonal, because there's a way that orthogonal can mean the opposite of what I intended to mean, like the complete opposite. Because in the programming language way, if things are orthogonal, that means they're composable to make a bigger thing, right? And that is actually good in game design. But what I'm trying to say here is sometimes there's just, you come up with some mechanics and they don't interact in any way and don't even apply to the same situations. And they're just like more things that happen in the game. And when you do that, it feels kind of dead and it feels like the game is trying very hard, right?
Yeah.
But when they interact with each other, that generates more possibility, and it generates uh, fun, essentially, or surprise, or just interestingness. And this has been known certainly since the 90s, probably since the 80s, or maybe even earlier, right? And so part of the idea of this game is to focus on that effect. Let's look at that effect very closely and just see what we can do with it. And that is the mission statement for this game. And so when we say, is this a good level? There's a bunch of criteria that I won't get into about how that's a good level. There's a speech actually that's related to this, that it's from IndieCade 2011. Me and Mark ten Bosch, who's been working on a game since then that still isn't out. If you think 10 years is a long time to work on a game, I know several people who have been working on games for substantially longer than that. Anyway, so um, there's a bunch of general criteria that propagate over, but some of them are very specific to this game. Like, okay, this game is about the combinatorics. Does this level observe some new space of the combinatorics? Does it use the objects to generate a new situation that we haven't seen before? Is that situation interesting? Um, Are we able to make that situation simply, or is it really contrived? Do we have to like pile a bunch of crap in the level to barely make this thing happen? That's probably a bad level, right? But again, in the same way with the programming language, where it's like the goal is to get the power first, and then maybe we can get some simplicity back later by refining the language design. Here it's like, okay, I made this interesting thing happen with this ugly level. Now that I have that, can we make it less ugly, right? Um, and so this is just how we decide, right? And um, for every game, though, because the ultimate idea behind the game is different, then the exact criteria for making those decisions is a little bit different.
Okay. Okay. I have a somewhat related question regarding this to The Witness, which I I'm not gonna spoil it as well, but like it's it is, let's say, about noticing patterns, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Was this the core idea of The Witness then? And the game is built around that? Or
Yes. There's another brief talk that I gave at Indiecade that I think is still on YouTube. This one's only 10 minutes, but this was like when I was early. I think it was also in 2011 or maybe 2012, where the game was still several years from being done, but it was far enough along that I knew that the design was successful and that it was going to be a good game, right? And I gave, it was sort of part of a panel talk where each of us spoke. The way you'll know it's the right one, maybe I can look it up after and you can put it in show notes or something. But it was also like Phil Fish, notorious game designer Phil Fish was also in this panel, I think. Or no, maybe that's a different one. I don't know.
if you manage to look it up, I can add it into the
Yeah,
show
I'll look
notes.
it up. Maybe this is, there's two different ones. Actually, this probably wasn't the Phil Fish one. Never mind. I will look it up and I will unambiguously, if I can, if it still exists on YouTube, I will give you the link. But during that one, I talk about what is essentially the core idea of the game. And I can try to describe it in a non spoilery way, right? Which is that in puzzle game design for a while, there's been this observation that some puzzles are a lot more fun and interesting to solve than other ones. And what is it? And Valve put it this way in a speech about Portal sometime. They said that in a when you solve a good puzzle, you have this aha moment where you really understand what it was about, right? And I actually try to take it further than they did. Like, I think designing just to create that kind of moment is a little bit too reductive because I think the content of what your aha is about, what that realization is about, actually matters. And so, one of the things we do in The Witness is try to build some kind of abstract picture out of all these moments. We string them together and try to make, and so from the puzzles in the very beginning of the game, when I used to go and talk about this game at speeches, I would take some of the very early puzzles, like just you go through the dots, right? Or you have the little things in the squares that are right outside the starting area. And I would talk about how you have to gain realization of what those mean from moment to moment, right? And um, it's uh, it's about sort of creating a continuous stream of those realizations as you go along. And that was the core idea of the game, although what I just said is one step more concrete. The actual core idea is more abstract than that. And but if people watch this speech, they'll see me give a pretty good explanation, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think draws you to games?
I don't know. Sometimes I wonder why I do all this anymore. Um, Part of that is just what part of the project I'm in. I'm really late in a project. And when that's true, you're in what is kind of the less exciting part because you were super excited in the beginning because the idea was new and you're like, oh man, this game's going to be so cool and whatever. Right. And then after you worked on it a couple years, it's been a lot of really hard work and it's tiring. And you're not as excited about these ideas because they're old ideas to you now. And part of the excitement of ideas is when they're new. And so there's some psychological skill involved in bringing back the excitement, making it fresh again, remembering why these are exciting ideas, right? Lately, this project has been so long that this past few weeks, I've been really excited just by like, oh my God, we're actually getting toward the end in a visible way. We're not just lost in the desert forever. And that's exciting. Um, but uh, I forgot what your original question was again.
What really
Uh,
draws you to games and
oh,
game
what draws me to
development?
games? Yeah. I I mean, I just always really liked games from even when I was a little kid, like before before I knew that I was going to work in games, I just made little hobby games on home computers. Like when I first learned to program, that was the very first thing I did was made a really stupid game on it. Um, yeah, I don't know. And then now it's a way for me to explore ideas about the world in like ideas about reality, like what is reality and what's going on and what are we doing. um I just have found this way to explore that through games that in some way is more unique because like our culture just hasn't done that very much, right? Like if I wanted to write some essays or some fictional novel that was inspired by like thinking about our role in the universe and what the universe is, it's like I could make an individual contribution, but there is a lot of that out there, right? And I would just be putting my own spot in there, although I can write a lot faster than I can program video games, so maybe that would have been a good idea. But instead, like this idea that there's a running system, like in some sense the universe is a running system, right? And so if you want to talk about it, having a running system that changes from moment to moment is um it certainly at least gives you a way to think about things or a way to talk about things. If you talk through the game, the actual game, and not the plot of the game or the setting of the game, if you actually use the interactivity of the game, it gives you a way to approach these topics that uh, can't be done anywhere else. And there don't seem to be very many people who are interested in this. Um, I probably know of, I don't know, how many people do I know who even are trying to do this in a serious way as opposed to just like whatever. I mean, I maybe know two other people on the whole planet Earth, right? So, uh, I mean, I've always wanted to do things that wouldn't be done if I didn't do them, and this definitely qualifies.
Okay. Okay. Do you know Tim Kaine, who worked on Fallout?
I don't think I've ever met him. I certainly know who he
Okay.
is, but I don't know him personally.
He started a YouTube channel some time ago, and he created this video, game development caution, when he was saying that like a lot changed in game dev industry since like in like the last 20 years or so, and there's a lot more like caution in terms of game programmers but also game ideas, and
Yeah.
was wondering what are your thoughts on that.
I know of this video. I haven't seen the actual video, so it's hard to respond to
Okay.
it. What I will say is I think that's true. Um, but it's very ironic because this has also been like when I entered video games, even by the time I'd only been in the industry 2 or 3 years, we would all go to the game developers conference, and all of us independent developers would be complaining about how AAA developers wouldn't take any risks and they didn't have that much creativity and all that, right? And so we already thought it was a problem back then. But yes, it's much more of a problem today than it was back then. It just keeps getting worse, right? So um I don't have a solution to that. I mean, I sort of did at one time, and that happened. Uh so I wrote this manifesto about all this in 2002, about how, look, it's not surprising that they don't take risks because these games are so expensive. And if you're going to lose all that money, you're not going to get more money. People aren't going to trust you with it, right? So it's not surprising that people are very conservative in that context. And so if we want creativity in game design, the place to do it is at smaller budget levels, right? So the place for creativity to happen is for indie developers to take the risks at low budget levels, and then that can create, like, if an indie makes a game mechanic that people like, that can create a pathway for higher budget level games to do that thing. And that has happened actually since then, over and over. That was actually the idea behind this thing that I did at the GDC for a while, called the Experimental Gameplay Workshop. um, it's since been taken over by people who have totally corrupted it, and it's no longer the cool thing that it used to be. But um, the but I don't just mean with regard to that workshop, but like the whole industry has ended up working like this. So there's all these things that are game mechanics in AAA games, um, that came from small indie projects, right? So like, what is one of the generic things that we have going on right now is we have all these hero shooters where you have skills and you have an ultimate that you build up, and then you can use it at the right moment and do something really powerful. And it's like, all that came from Dota, which was a Warcraft mod made by just like some dude, right?
Yeah.
Or like, I think tower defense came first, and that was just like a mod, and then Dota was like a mod for tower defense or something. I don't exactly remember how it worked, but that was essentially, that project was so indie it wasn't even really commercial at all, right? And yet that was now the foundation of one of the ideas that all these AAA developers can't even get away from. They just keep doing it over and over, right? And that has happened repeatedly in many cats. So like battle royales, when those were big for a while, right? Those, like, obviously, PUBG was pretty big, but that got, I forget what that dude's smaller thing was before that. I think it was also a mod. Um,
The
you see it every.
Arma or Rust.
It might have been an Arma mod.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. But the point being, you just see this literally everywhere, is that the experimentation happens, it catches on. Okay, so here's another place where it happened so quickly and burned itself out so quickly that you could see the entire cycle, right? Which is all the auto battler games,
Oh yeah.
where like somebody had like a Dota 2 mod that was like auto chess or
Oh,
something,
well,
and
this
then
was Valve original thing. I think.
no, Valve cloned it. Some indie guys had the original auto chess mod, and they tried to sell it to Valve, and Valve was like, no, we'll just build our own. I think is the way it played out. But then like all these other companies made their own auto battlers, and there was like the year of the auto battler because these were so easy to put together. um, and then it turned out people didn't really want to play this game that much. It just was exciting because it was a little bit new, and it burned itself out within literally like a year or
Yeah.
2 years, maybe. I don't know. So you can see these things happen. And that's really the only place that innovation comes from anymore, is like smaller indies. And the thing that bums me out is that most indie games are actually not that creative either. They're just making some game with slightly different characters and slightly different mechanics. But sometimes games are still trying to be different. And that's literally all the design life that we have left in the game industry. It's not coming from the high budget companies at all.
Why is that people decide to like start the indie career and then they do the project that doesn't really do anything new?
I think people just have different reasons for wanting to be in games, and some of those reasons are fine. Like, for some people, it's just enough to make a cool game that's theirs, that does exactly what they want to do, with like new characters or something, right? Or a new art style. Or not even new, but like, this is my art style that I want. And that's not bad. Like, obviously, if you look at some much older genre like literature, right? Most literature is not experimental literature that's trying to innovate in the form. It's just stories that people wanted to tell, right? And so that's probably mostly what's happening in games now, is these are just games that people wanted. to make, and they're not really pushing the medium. I've always been about pushing the medium because I think there's a long way to push it still. I think we don't really understand that well what games could really be. And so with every one of my projects, I'm trying to push on some boundary to do something new. But there's plenty of reasons to make games. Like, look, if you make a game that somebody really likes and they get a lot of enjoyment about out of playing, who cares if it's like innovative or whatever, right? I mean, you made a good experience for somebody, and that's cool. That's like, we have to not forget that that's totally fine. Um, but also, though, I think if we don't have this inflow of creativity coming in, we're really missing something, you know?
It ties into the subject of like, I met at the conference a developer who said that he should have done the better thing, like Stardew Valley, and stick with the game he made and try to create, like, because it was successful, like, try to create sort of community around it, updated DLC patches and things like that, instead of just starting a new game that was a long shot and didn't pan out. And there's a lot of games now that try to be sort of like not even like a franchise, but like a community that like grows. What do you think
Yeah.
about this like game development style?
I mean, I think it's fine. It obviously works for some people, but if you're a developer and you think, oh, I did this and I should have done this other thing, you're assuming that you know how the other thing would have gone. Maybe you would try to build a community. And because everybody's trying to build communities now, there's more communities than there is demand for communities. And so it's very hard to build a community now, probably. And so maybe it would have gone as bad or worse, except you wouldn't have even had a new game. You would have only had your old game, right? So it's very hard to know what is really the best thing to do or how things will go. So far, since I did Braid, which was I was in the games industry for a while before that, but that was like the first thing in like what I've been doing since then of these kind of art games. I've always been working on single player puzzle games, and that's just a certain kind of thing that is not very conducive to community building, right? Like the kind of game that you have a community around is something like Stardew Valley or like Terraria, Terraria or something, um, where there's just a lot of replayability, and a lot of like, oh, this can be my hobby for a really long time, which is hard to be true for a puzzle game that's like short and then you finish it. Although who knows, maybe this new game is so long that someone can play it for like 2 years, uh, and it'll be their fun thing. Um, but yeah, like that strategy, if you want to call it a strategy, works better on some games and worse on some other games, right? If you have a multiplayer game, it's much easier to have a community, right? Because people are online to begin with to play it. However, most multiplayer games are kind of just clones of each other now, even more so than single player games. And so that's really weird. Uh, so then it can be harder to differentiate if you're just a clone of, like, so one of these trends is, so because we're getting worse at making games, because games are so complicated, they take so long. Um, Things that are not very easy, like auto battlers, just take so long. So like there was this big PUBG thing when PUBG came out, and then you had all these battle royales trying to follow, and Fortnite followed it really fast, but there were other ones that took longer. But then even not that long after that, you had like Escape from Tarkov, which has become the genre we now know of as extraction shooter, right? And there were some people trying to clone it right away, but they didn't get very far. And it took until 2024 for like, or maybe 2023 for legitimate extraction shooter competition to start entering. And Escape from Tarkov showed up on the scene. I don't remember what year, 2019, 2018, something like that. It took like years and years for people to try to clone this game. And none of the clones have been like as successful that I've seen. They've all just sort of started out and then fizzled. And that just goes to show that like this whole dynamic is complicated and difficult. And it's even if you have this ready-made community of like the Escape from Tarkov community, and you're making a game like one of these games, which I just saw a streamer play for a little bit. I think it's not even out yet. I think it's still in beta. Is like this game Delta Force. I think that's in closed beta or something. I don't know. You can fact check this at the end. Uh, but it doesn't seem very successful to me. Like nobody's really talking about it. Maybe that's because it's in closed beta, or maybe that's because it just totally hasn't succeeded, right? And so even when you think you can hook into an existing community, sometimes it's just really difficult to do. On the other hand, so Jason Rohrer, who's one of the guys who's another independent game developer who's actually doing experimental things, he made a game some years ago called 1 Hour, 1 Life, where it's a very lo-fi game. It's just 2D. It's networked, but it's 2D, and you just walk around, kind of like Don't Starve or something like that, but lower budget. And but it was very ambitious in that the idea is you log into the game, you only live for 1 hour, and then your character dies. But you and all the other players have to somehow build a civilization. And there's like a really big tech tree starting with, sticks and stones and ending with like computers and spaceships. And you have to do that whole tech tree when your characters die in an hour, right? And
When was it released?
a long time ago, I don't remember what year. Let's look up 1 Hour, 1 Life release date. A
Do,
long time ago.
do you know whether
2018.
they achieved computers?
Um, in the early days, the whole tech tree hadn't been built out, and that's when I was following the game. So I'm not sure how that has gone, but it was a very successful game for him, and it had a community of people who were super into this game. Part of that is because it was so different from anything else. Like that description that I just gave, I'm not aware of any other game trying to be anything close to that. I mean, there's a couple of games that are vaguely in the same dimension, but there's nothing that's really that game. So that was one way that maybe you get a community, is with uniqueness, right? Or whatever. Um, but can you just walk up with a generic game and have it succeed? Or if it doesn't succeed, build a community and have that succeed? I mean, maybe, because it's very unpredictable business, but um, I would say that that's the low probability of success
Okay.
route.
Okay. So we're not planning to build functionalities like leaving notes in Sokoban game from one player
No,
to other players,
no,
like in
there's not
Dark
going to be
Souls.
like trap ahead
Yeah.
or whatever.
Okay. Okay. Where do you get your motivation from, given that you get a lot of vitriol on the internet?
I don't know if I really do anymore. There was definitely a time when I did, and it makes me very fed up with communities. But at this point, like, here's the thing. Uh, like the thing about the internet is it's very negative, really, toward anyone doing anything interesting. And really, the pill for that to me is even today. Like, so Elon Musk has gone through several cycles of people liking him and people thinking he's stupid and whatever. But even today, there's a large percentage of people out there who are like, this guy's just an idiot. He doesn't know anything. And he just like inherited money and bought rocket ships with it or something. I don't know what they think, but like, here's a person who has single-handedly changed civilization in a very positive way more than once, right? And yet this person has people saying negative things about him all the time, right? Now, the people saying those negative things, I mean, there certainly are some criticisms you could have about him, but there's criticisms you could have about anybody, right? And like, why are you so interested in criticizing this person? You know, there's just something about human psychology that under certain conditions makes us want to attack people, right? And once you recognize that that's what that is, and then also that um, that most of the people doing this kind of internet attacking are doing it because they don't have anything better to do with their time. Like most people who are doing productive things that are difficult, like they don't have time to sit on the internet all day and say stuff about people. They're like doing things. And then, so like, okay, hey, I make a programming language. There's other people making programming languages. Am I going to look at someone else's language and go, that guy's stupid. He's an idiot. He doesn't know anything. He's like unethical, blah, 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 for not using memory safety. No, I'm not going to do that because I understand that the space of decisions is very complex and there's a number of opinions that you could have about how things are going to go. And I think I'm in a better place in that space of decisions than, let's say, my so-called competitors, although there's no money involved really, so whatever. But because I understand the size and complexity of the space and how difficult it can be to implement things, um, you just don't, like, once you're a player in that, there's just no reason to denigrate somebody else who's playing in the same territory unless you just have psychological problems or something. So most people don't, right? Um, like you don't see people who have made successful video games that make money going around telling other game designers that they're stupid. Like that's just not usually how it works. Um, Sometimes it is. So you have like Linux Torvalds yelling at programmers. Although Linus has mellowed out a little bit these days, but you know, but also there are also reasons to be very stringent and exacting about quality when you're trying to get people to do well. It's just there are more productive ways to do it than that. But I understand. Like, so the thing I'm trying to get at is when you see this giant wave of internet negativity, and I've had people with hundreds of thousands, or in some case, millions of followers, like retweeting all their followers with like very selectively curated things to make me look as evil and stupid as possible. And I've had waves of this that last for like 2 weeks of people putting shitty negative comments into my feed and all this, like literally 2 weeks of it. Um, and it's just, you realize at some point that this is all low quality stuff. Like this is not high quality information coming into my feed. This is like just garbage, right? And so are you going to let yourself be controlled by garbage? And I don't mean the people. I don't mean like the Trump garbage people comments. I mean like just this flow of negativity coming in. And a lot of people will. A lot of people will let themselves be controlled by the. Um, and I kind of get that because it really is, it really sucks. Um, but at the same time, I've always been an independent thinker. And what does it mean to be an independent thinker? It means that your opinion is not controlled by the opinions of others. And here's the thing, as a society, that's going to be who the real creative people are. Like, what does it mean to be creative? It means you had an idea that is different from the ideas that other people had, and then you went and made it or something, right? In order to have an idea that's different from what other people have, you have to be thinking in some territory that they weren't thinking in somehow. You have to have some kind of beliefs or motivations that were different from other people's, because otherwise there's so many people in the world that they would have done it already. And so the thing that we haven't come to grips with is that the people who are creative are going to be the people who you don't agree with on everything, because that's the definition of creative, right? And so are you going to build a society and an online culture in which you violently, in terms of like what am I trying to say? I'm thinking of different words, just very with extreme uh negativity and prejudice assault anything that doesn't 100% align with everything that you think somebody's supposed to believe? Or are you going to let creative people disagree with you because you value the creativity that they contribute to society? And I'm not talking about me. I'm not saying, oh, I'm so creative, but like hundreds or thousands of people on the internet, this has been the pattern with. at least. Those are the ones I know of. I could probably name over 100 without stopping, right? But um and I think, well, the table has turned, at least in the US. Um the atmosphere has shifted very quickly. It turns out nobody really liked this, and all the people who used to do this are off like hiding on Blue Sky or whatever and attacking each other. And then, we just had giant platform like, Mark Zuckerberg, who runs not just one of the biggest social media platforms, but like three at least, just said, hey, we're going to be a lot more about free speech and, you know, not claiming that there's one right viewpoint to have. Right. And so I think we've passed through this time. Hopefully, at least things can always turn again. Right. And I realize in Europe, things are a lot worse. There's not really free speech anywhere in Europe that I can tell right now. Um, or I mean, England is no longer part of Europe, right? But that's one of the places where it's the worst right now. Like they're arresting people for saying relatively normal things. And so I don't know where that's going to go. And it could always turn back around in the US, but right now it feels a lot better here. And I'm glad that I held on to um, my self-respect and my individuality and my ability to think whatever I want to think, right? And didn't succumb, because the number one pattern of this cancel culture that's been running the internet for the past 10 years was people assault you, they try to destroy your reputation, they try to destroy your good standing in polite society, and then they just say, well, you have to apologize, right? And apologizing isn't isn't worth anything. It just, because they'll still keep attacking you after that. Nobody will remember the apology and everyone will remember the bad thing. But what apology does is it's you admitting that they're correct, right? That they were correct to have this issue with you and to attack you in this way. And so from then on, you can never be right anymore. That's the function of the apology, is it's the final victory. And I'm glad that I never apologized for anything that people were angry at me for. And I can think of some other prominent cases in which I'm glad that they didn't apologize either, because if everybody had just apologized and capitulated 100% of the time, we would no longer have the free speech in America that we have now. And it's probably important to the continuing of civilization that we have this free speech. And so I'm very glad to have done my very, very, very small part in that. Who knows though? It still kind of sucks. It still kind of. So do you know what just happened? Please keep this in the meeting. Um, I just got disconnected and it said you got disconnected due to a server error. And I went and looked, and it's because, once in a while Google logs you out and makes you log in again.
Okay.
They logged me out in the middle of the meeting, and then that made the meeting fail. So I had to like log back into my Google account, which, by the way, your password is saved in your web browser. So it's literally just clicking the button like, no, I didn't want to be logged out. And that made the meeting fail in the middle. So this is just
it's
another example
it
of
was
how
security.
bad software is.
It was
Yeah, it's
security.
very secure. If I can't have a meeting, then nobody impersonating me can have a meeting.
Exactly.
Anyway, it kind of sucks that, like, if people search for me on the internet, there's probably a lot of just negative things that they could find that are distortions, that are not things that I said or believed. But the number one tactic is to take anything you
Yeah.
said and trim it down into the most negative attention getting thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so maybe that'll kick up again. But as of right now, um, I'm glad that I stood by my principles. We'll see.
What were
We'll
you?
see.
What were you most attacked for? Were there
I don't know. There's
single things
several
or
things.
just?
I was actually fortunate because the first mass attack that I got was so random and clearly had nothing to do with me that it prepared me for the later ones. So the first one was actually Gamergate. And what happened in Gamergate was they were chasing down all sorts of things, which about game journalism and all that, and looking for corruption. And then one of the corruptions that they thought they found was, to bring back Phil Fish, who was a notorious game developer at this point. Um, He wasn't yet as notorious back then, but he made this game called Fez, which was signed to Indie Fund in um, whatever year that was, 2010, 2011, I don't know, one of those years, uh, 2012. Um, and it also won the award uh, in the IGF, like one of the game design awards. And some of the members in Indie Fund were on the award committee, and they were like, "This is corruption. Indie Fund was cheating at the awards," right? And Indie Fund was a game funding thing that I was one of the co-founders of, right? Um, and then they really harassed one or two people who were not me more, but they also harassed me, and I was like, "Look, guys, you may not have looked at a calendar, but the IGF awards, like they take place at the beginning of March or whatever it was, maybe even February back then, like really early in the year. And if you look when we signed Fez, it was late in the year. Like, yes, we signed both those events happened in the same year, but they were in the opposite order. We signed Fez to Indie Fund in part because it was so successful and won awards and stuff. And we were like, okay, let's back this game, right? And but that's whatever. It wasn't, it wasn't the worst thing, but I had about 4 or 5 days of people yelling at me in the inbox or saying like, "Oh, we're sicking the Securities and Exchange Commission on you. Have fun in jail," or whatever. And I'm just like, guys. So I actually made a fake apology where I was like, "Yes, it's true. We invented a time machine and went back in time to the awards and voted the other way for this game so that we would make money." And that was kind of funny. And so that prepared me for this modern wave of internet harassment. But honestly, um, the other, so the social justice thing, so-called justice, you could put quotes around both of those words, which was the term. Nobody really uses that term anymore, but that was what it was around 2014 when this sort of started as like the backlash to Gamergate or whatever. Those people are way, way, way worse. Um, and the reason is because they will legitimately attempt to ruin your name in all of society. Like they'll call you sexist or they'll call you racist or whatever. And if you just get, if somebody Googles you and it says this person is a racist, I never had racist, I don't think, or I'm sure a lot of people said that, but like, because they say anything, but I'm just taking that as an example. Like that really is pretty bad. Like if anyone who wants to know anything about you does a search and it says, "Oh, this person's accused of this bad thing," all over the place. Um, and so, that's actually not what people are. I mean, I've never had the racism problem that I know of. Some people called me sexist for reasons that we won't get into. I'm not sexist, but some people called me that. Um, really, the thing that people are the most mad about me for is I'm not communist and I'm not socialist. And like among indie game developers, that's like the absolute worst thing. To believe that uh, there's merit and that people who work hard should be rewarded for working harder, um, and that not everybody should be compensated equally because not everybody brings equal amounts of effort or equal amounts of talent, or even ignoring all that. Like the structure of a situation may be just such that one person's role is more valuable to getting the thing done or helping it make money or whatever. Like that person should be compensated more, even if that person is equally talented or less talented than somebody else, just because their contribution in terms of the creation of wealth was bigger, right? And this is the foundation, right? It's like, so either you believe, so all the people who are mad, all the indie developers who are mad, believe in this like communist utopia where everybody's life is better than it is now because we've changed the economic system to something unspecified. Certainly it's not that version of communism that failed every other time. And certainly it won't cause millions of people to be mass murdered like those other times, but it'll just be something that we can't tell you what it is because we don't know, but it's going to be great, trust me. And it's not capitalism, because capitalism is terrible. Like all those people who are like the majority. The thing is, it's a minority. Like almost nobody actually believes this, but it you're punished so severely for speaking out, for saying no, I don't think that's a good idea, that you'll just get demolished, right, by the vocal people in the industry. And these are still the most vocal people in the industry now. um you know it's kind of crazy. So that's actually what people are in the past many years. That's what people are the most angry at me about. Also, just other just libertarian-ish stuff. I'm not really a libertarian. I think there should be a healthy amount of government, but like I said, like, hey, we shouldn't have mask mandates, right? Or no, sorry, I said vaccine mandates. I said we shouldn't mandate that people take this weird gene therapy to keep their job. And like, people were so angry at me for years. And guess what? Now that's the accepted position. Like the small parts of America, like some places in the military and the government that required people to take this vaccine to keep their job, have now all gotten sued, and people have won those lawsuits, and they won a lot of money because it was unconstitutional and illegal, right?
And
But I said this on the internet at the wrong time,
exactly.
um, and got a lot of people very angry at me. And so it's just all these things. There's a certain it change. This is the thing that you notice, though. It changes from year to year. There's some groupthink that a certain category of people just swear to, like, they can't possibly believe that this groupthink could ever be wrong, and they'll get incredibly angry at you for questioning it. And then 3 years later, it's like, oh yeah, that was not right. Um,
Or you just forget that it
or
exists.
yeah, well, that too, that too. All
Okay.
right, we have at most 10 more minutes because I have
Yes.
literally another
Okay.
meeting at
So I
2.
have
But
two things. First
yeah,
of all, my internet mind thinks
yeah,
like this. Casey says he hates design or he's bad at design. He doesn't want to do design. Casey
yeah,
Muratori. But he loves programming. And here's
yeah.
Jonathan Blow, programmer turned into game designer. And they all know each other, supposedly like each other. Why there's no game project of Casey and Jonathan Blow combining forces?
The, you could ask this about any two people who you know of from doing work, and the answer is they're kind of busy on their own things.
Yeah.
Like, I made a programming language. I know Casey well enough that if he were to design a programming language, it would be very different, right? And
Yeah.
so that collaboration wouldn't make that much sense in that space. When it comes to game design, he actually did help out on The Witness, um, for a little bit. You can find on the internet, there's a video where he
Yeah.
talks about the collision system that he made. That's not a, you know, code designer kind of collaboration or anything like that, but it is a significant contribution that made the game better than it would have been, for sure. But yeah, the answer is just we're usually busy and we're doing things that we're very interested in. He's very much on this educational route, right? So he's doing his computer enhanced stuff, and that takes a lot of his time as well, right? I will say, I think Casey is better at design than he claims, but I do think he just doesn't like design as much, or not in the same way as me, or something. He doesn't spend as much time on it as I do. So that's just the situation there. But that's just literally what it is for everything. It's so much work to do these things that, like, everybody's busy doing their stuff, and it's just hard to form collaborations. Like, I didn't expect this game to take frickin' 10 years. I expected it to take 18 months to 2 years, because it was supposed to be a much, much smaller game. So what if I had started that as a collaboration with somebody and then it turned into a 10-year thing? Like, one or the other person would have bailed out, right?
Yeah.
Or something. So it's fine.
Okay. Have you seen any of the fan channels that clips your streams, like do the highlights?
Sometimes, yeah. And some of those I think are pretty fine and valuable for people, but some of them I really don't like the way they come out, you know. Like, so one of the examples of a distortion that's probably very innocent, right? But again, gets me a lot of hate, is like, so I played Elden Ring, And the first session that I played for a couple hours. I had a very rough time getting into the game and understanding the game. I didn't like it very much because I hadn't really played any of the like Bloodborne or Dark Souls or any of that, right? And so I just sort of gave my comments at the end of that first play session. But I was like, yeah, but I'll continue to play. But I was like, oh, this is a rough game. I didn't really like it, etc. Um, I went on to play 40 to 50 to 60 more hours of the game, and I ended up liking it more because once you get into it and it works better, you know, you can do the combat and it's more fun and stuff. I didn't play it all the way through, but I played it pretty far for someone who has all this work to do. But, you know, this clip goes out and it's just this one clip of me saying I didn't like it that much. And that's what everybody on the internet thinks I think of Elden Ring now. And because
Yeah.
there's so many like fanboys of this genre, they're all mad at me because I think they think I think Elden Ring sucks. And it's like, no, I played it pretty far. It was fine. But people don't see that. They just see the clip. And so that's the problem with this kind of a thing.
But
Um,
there are great edits. Have you seen the Jonathan Blow clips that made me consider quitting my job for real?
No, you know, once in a while, one of these will come up on YouTube because of the algorithm, and I mostly don't click on them, sorry, because I just don't. I I w- I don't want to be like narcissistic and watching. Oh, this is clips people made of me. To some extent, it's just fine to let that be what it is, and I'll just pretend that I'm not seeing it, and it's fine.
I send you
So I
this
don't
one.
know.
I
I
send you
haven't seen
this
most.
one. This one part in particular. Okay. I send
Okay,
you. This is
all right.
really cool. I love it. Like
I don't
it's
know if I will watch it, but you can
okay.
send it.
Okay. What games do you play now?
Not that many because it's just hard to find games that I know that I'm gonna want to play. I can name some games that I played recently. If usually when I try to answer this question, I also just forget, right? Because I work on so many different things and my mind's changing around all the time. Um, I definitely played Stalker 2 recently, right? For some number of, I probably played that for like 10 hours or something, and I kind of bounced off it. Um, I play a lot of the Zachtronic Solitaire collection.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay,
that's
yeah,
been
yeah.
my go-to game. I've got like more than 1,000 wins. I've got like 1,400 wins, but that's starting to be a little much. I played Lock Digital recently, which was a little puzzle game someone made. Seems like very few people have played that, but I bought that and played it. I played the Indiana Jones and the Great Circle
Okay.
briefly. Did not like that game at all. Bailed. I'm looking through my Steam
Yeah.
list right now to aid my memory. I played Path of Exile for around 15 hours. Didn't like that. There was this little Minesweeper kind of game called Proverbs that I actually played for 10 hours because I would just sort of start it up at the end of a stream when I was tired. Um,
Balatro?
I played that when it came out, which was more than a year ago, actually, I think.
Okay.
But I enjoyed that for a bit, and then you know, that was a time when I was very busy because I was trying to get work done on Braid Anniversary Edition, so I didn't have a lot of game time. Um, what else? UFO 50 I played some of. I didn't play all 50 games. Core Keeper I played a bunch of. Uh, Warhammer Space Marine 2 I played for like 1 hour. I don't know. Let me see on Steam. What does it say? 49 minutes. I played that for 49 minutes. Um,
Animal Well?
so mostly I just play games to
Animal
see
Well?
what's going on. Yeah, I played Animal Well. I played to the ending and then passed it for a while where you're sort of starting to do some of the more secret stuff, but then I kind of bounced off it, you know, at that point.
Okay.
But I played that game and I kind of enjoyed it and kind of was really frustrated with it, because it can be a really frustrating game a lot of the time.
Okay.
So
Okay then. We're reaching the end. So thank you so much for joining me.
yeah, right on. And thanks for doing this. And I'm glad we could have such a wide-ranging conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for like you're you're unscripted and unfiltered. I think you're treating the internet as it came out and it's very inspiring
Yes.
to a lot of people.
Sometimes it causes me problems.
Yes.
But if we're in a world where we can't speak openly about the things we care about, that doesn't sound very good to me. So
Yeah, I think
I'm going to try to do what I can to preserve what we have sometimes.
thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Game Engineering Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and follow on Spotify and other podcasting platforms. See you in the next episode.